Chapter 1 of Love and Mr Lewisham. This is a LibreVox recording. All LibreVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibreVox.org. Recording by Anthony Ogus. Love and Mr Lewisham by H.G. Wells. Chapter 1. Introduces Mr Lewisham. The opening chapter does not concern itself with love. Indeed, that antagonist does not certainly appear until the third. Mr Lewisham is seen at his studies. It was 10 years ago, and in those days he was assistant master in the Whortley Proprietary School, Whortley, Sussex, and his wages were £40 a year, out of which he had to afford 15 shillings a week during term time to lodge with Mrs Munday at the little shop in the West Street. He was called Mr. to distinguish him from the bigger boys, whose duty it was to learn, and it was a matter of stringent regulation that he should be addressed as Sir. He wore ready-made clothes. His black jacket of rigid line was dusted about the front and sleeves with scholastic chalk, and his face was downy, and his moustache incipient. He was a passable-looking youngster of 18, fair-haired, indifferently barbered, and with a quite unnecessary pair of glasses on his fairly prominent nose. He wore these to make himself look older, that discipline might be maintained. At the particular moment when this story begins, he was in his bedroom. An attic it was, with lead-framed dormer windows, a slanting ceiling and a bulging wall, covered, as a number of torn places is witnessed, with innumerable strata of florid old-fashioned paper. To judge by the room, Mr Lewisham thought little of love, but much on greatness. Over the head of the bed, for example, where good folks hang texts, these truths asserted themselves, written in a clear, bold, youthfully florid hand. Knowledge is power, and what man has done, man can do. Man in the second instance, referring to Mr Lewisham. Never for a moment were these things to be forgotten. Mr Lewisham could see them afresh every morning as his head came through his shirt. And over the yellow-painted box upon which, for lack of shelves, Mr Lewisham's library was arranged, was a schema. Why he should not have headed it "Scheme," the editor of the Church Times, who calls his miscellaneous notes "Varia," is better able to say than I. In this scheme, 1892 was indicated as the year in which Mr Lewisham proposed to take his B.A. degree at the London University with honours in all subjects, and 1895 as the date of his gold medal. Subsequently there were to be pamphlets in the liberal interest, and such like things duly dated. Who would control others must first control himself, remarked the wall over the wash-hand stand, and behind the door against the Sunday trousers was a portrait of Carlyle. These were no mere threats against the universe. Operations had begun. Jostling Shakespeare, Emerson's Essays, and the penny life of Confucius, there were battered and defaced school books, a number of the excellent manuals of the Universal Correspondence Association, exercise books, ink red and black in penny bottles, and an india rubber stamp with Mr Lewisham's name. A trophy of bluish-green South Kensington certificates for geometrical drawing, astronomy, physiology, physiography, and inorganic chemistry adorned his further wall, and against the Carlyle portrait was a manuscript list of French irregular verbs. Attached by a drawing pin to the roof of the wash-hand stand, which, the room being an attic, sloped almost dangerously, dangled a time-table. Mr Lewisham was to rise at 5, and that this was no vain boasting, a cheap American alarum clock by the books on the box witnessed. The lumps of mellow chocolate on the papered ledge by the bedhead endorsed that evidence. French until 8, said the time-table curtly. Breakfast was to be eaten in 20 minutes, then 25 minutes of literature, to be precise, learning extracts, preferably pompous, from the plays of William Shakespeare, and then to school and duty. The time-table further prescribed Latin composition for the recess and the dinner hour. Literature, however, during the meal, and varied its injunctions for the rest of the 24 hours according to the day of the week. Not a moment for Satan, and that mischief still of his. Only 70 has the confidence, as well as the time, to be idle. But just think of the admirable quality of such a scheme. Up and busy at 5, with all the world about one horizontal, warm, dreamy-brained or stupidly hullish, if roused, roused only to grunt and sigh and roll over again into oblivion. By 8, 3 hours clear start, 3 hours knowledge ahead of every one. It takes, I have been told by an eminent scholar, about 1,000 hours of sincere work to learn a language completely, after 3 or 4 languages much less, which gives you, even at the outset, one each a year before breakfast. The gift of tongues, picked up like mushrooms. Then that literature, an astonishing conception. In the afternoon, mathematics and the sciences. Could anything be simpler or more magnificent? In 6 years Mr Lewisham will have his 5 or 6 languages, a sound all-round education, a habit of tremendous industry, and be still but 24. He will already have honour in his university, and ampler means. One realises that those pamphlets in the liberal interests will be no obscure platitudes. Where Mr Lewisham will be at 30 stirs the imagination. There will be modifications of the schema, of course, as experience widens, but the spirit of it is a devouring flame. He was sitting facing the diamond-framed window, writing fast, on a second yellow box that was turned on end and empty, and the lid was open, and his knees were conveniently stuck into the cavity. The bed was strewn with books and copygraphed sheets of instructions from his remote correspondence tutors. Pursuant to the dangling timetable, he was, you would have noticed, translating Latin into English. Imperceptibly the speed of his writing diminished. Urit me glycerai nitor lay ahead and troubled him. Urit me, he murmured, and his eyes travelled from his book out of window to the vicar's roof opposite and its ivied chimneys. His brows were knit at first and then relaxed. Urit me? He had put his pen into his mouth and glanced about for his dictionary. Harari? Suddenly his expression changed. Movement dictionary ward ceased. He was listening to a light tapping sound. It was a footfall outside. He stood up abruptly and, stretching his neck, peered through his unnecessary glasses and the diamond panes down into the street. Looking acutely downward, he could see a hat daintily trimmed with pinkish white blossom, the shoulder of a jacket, and just the tips of nose and chin. Certainly the stranger who sat under the gallery last Sunday next the Frobishers. Then, too, he had seen her only obliquely. He watched her until she passed beyond the window frame. He strained to see impossibly round the corner. Then he started, frowned, took his pen from his mouth. "This wandering attention," he said. "The slightest thing. Where was I? Tcha!" He made a noise with his teeth to express his irritation, sat down and replaced his knees in the upturned box. "Urit me," he said, biting the end of his pen and looking for his dictionary. It was a Wednesday half-holiday late in March. A spring day, glorious in amber light, dazzling white clouds and the intensest blue, casting a powder of wonderful green hither and thither among the trees, and rousing all the birds to tumultuous rejoicings. A rousing day, a clamatory insistent day, a veritable herald of summer. The stir of that anticipation was in the air, the warm earth was parting above the swelling seeds, and all the pine woods were full of the minute crepitation of opening bud scales. And not only was the stir of Mother Nature's awakening in the earth and the air and the trees, but also in Mr Lewisham's youthful blood, bidding him rouse himself to live in a sense quite other than that the schema indicated. He saw the dictionary peeping from under a paper, looked up Urit May, appreciated the shining nitor of Glycera's shoulders, and so fell idle again, to rouse himself abruptly. "I can't fix my attention," said Mr. Lewisham. He took off the needless glasses, wiped them, and blinked his eyes. This confounded Horace and his stimulating epithets. "A walk?" "I won't be beat," he said, incorrectly, replaced his glasses, brought his elbows down on either side of his box with resonant violence, and clutched the hair over his ears with both hands. In 5 minutes' time he found himself watching the swallows curving through the blue over the vicarage garden. "Did ever man have such a bother with himself as me?" he asked vaguely but vehemently. "It's self-indulgence, does it? Sitting down's the beginning of laziness." So he stood up to his work and came into permanent view of the village street. "If she has gone round the corner by the post office, she will come in sight over the palings above the allotments," suggested the unexplored and undisciplined region of Mr. Lewisham's mind. She did not come into sight. Apparently she had not gone round by the post office after all. It made one wonder where she had gone. Did she go up through the town to the avenue on these occasions? Then abruptly a cloud drove across the sunlight, the glowing street went cold, and Mr. Lewisham's imagination submitted to control. So Mater Saeva Cupidinum, the untamable mother of desires, Horace, Book 2 of the Odes, was the author appointed by the University for Mr. Lewisham's matriculation, was, after all, translated to its prophetic end. Precisely as the church clock struck 5, Mr. Lewisham, with a punctuality that was indeed almost too prompt for a really earnest student, shut his Horace, took up his Shakespeare, and descended the narrow curved uncarpeted staircase that led from his garret to the living room in which he had his tea with his landlady, Mrs. Munday. That good lady was alone, and after a few civilities Mr. Lewisham opened his Shakespeare and read from a mark onward that mark, by the by, was in the middle of a scene while he consumed mechanically a number of slices of bread and wort jam. Mrs. Munday watched him over her spectacles and thought how bad so much reading must be for the eyes, until the tinkling of her shop bell called her away to a customer. At 25 minutes to 6 he put the book back in the window sill, dashed a few crumbs from his jacket, assumed a mortar-board cap that was lying on the tea caddy, and went forth to his evening preparation duty. The West Street was empty and shining golden with the sunset. Its beauty seized upon him, and he forgot to repeat the passage from Henry VIII that should have occupied him down the street. Instead, he was presently thinking of that insubordinate glance from his window, and of little chins and nose tips. His eyes became remote in their expression. The school door was opened by an obsequious little boy with lines to be examined. Mr. Lewisham felt a curious change of atmosphere on his entry. The door slammed behind him. The hall, with its insistent scholastic suggestions, its yellow marbled paper, its long rows of hat pegs, its disreputable array of umbrellas, a broken mortar-board and a tattered and scattered Principia, seemed dim and dull in contrast with the luminous stir of the early March evening outside. An unusual sense of the greyness of a teacher's life, of the greyness indeed of the life of all studious souls, came and went in his mind. He took the lines, written painfully over 3 pages of exercise book, and obliterated them with a huge GEL scrawled monstrously across each page. He heard the familiar mingled noises of the playground drifting into him through the open schoolroom door. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Love and Mr. Lewisham by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anthony Ogus. As the wind blows. A flaw in that pentagram of a timetable that pentagram by which the demons of distraction were to be excluded from Mr. Lewisham's career to greatness, was the absence of a clause forbidding study out of doors. It was the day after the trivial window peeping of the last chapter that this gap in the timetable became apparent, a day if possible more gracious and alluring than its predecessor, and at 12:30, instead of returning from the school directly to his lodging, Mr. Lewisham escaped through the omission and made his way, Horace in pocket, to the park gates, and so to the avenue of ancient trees that encircles the broad Hawtley domain. He dismissed a suspicion of his motive with perfect success. In the avenue, for the path is but little frequented, one might expect to read undisturbed. The open air, the erect attitude, are surely better than sitting in a stuffy, enervating bedroom. The open air is distinctly healthy, hardy, simple. The day was breezy, and there was a perpetual rustling, a going and coming in the budding trees. The network of the beeches was full of golden sunlight, and all the lower branches were shot with horizontal dashes of new-born green. Tu nisi ventis debes ludibrium cave was the appropriate matter of Mr. Lewisham's thoughts, and he was mechanically trying to keep the book open in 3 places at once, at the text, the notes, and the literal translation, while he turned up the vocabulary for ludibrium, when his attention, wandering dangerously near the top of the page, fell over the edge and escaped with incredible swiftness down the avenue. A girl wearing a straw hat adorned with white blossom was advancing towards him. Her occupation too was literary. Indeed, she was so busy writing that evidently she did not perceive him. Unreasonable emotions descended upon Mr. Lewisham, emotions that are unaccountable on the mere hypothesis of a casual meeting. Something was whispered. It sounded suspiciously like, "It's her." He advanced with his fingers in his book, ready to retreat to its pages if she looked up, and watched her over it. Ludibrium passed out of his universe. She was clearly unaware of his nearness, he thought, intent upon her writing, whatever that might be. He wondered what it might be. Her face, foreshortened by her downward regard, seemed infantile. Her fluttering skirt was short, and showed her shoes and ankles. He noted her graceful, easy steps. A figure of health and lightness it was, sunlit, and advancing towards him, something, as he afterwards recalled with a certain astonishment, quite outside the schema. Nearer she came and nearer, her eyes still downcast. He was full of vague, stupid promptings towards an uncalled-for intercourse. It was curious she did not see him. He began to expect almost painfully the moment when she would look up, though what there was to expect. He thought of what she would see when she discovered him, and wondered where the tassel of his cap might be hanging. It sometimes occluded one eye. It was, of course, quite impossible to put up a hand and investigate. He was near trembling with excitement. His paces, acts which are usually automatic, became uncertain and difficult. One might have thought he had never passed a human being before. Still nearer, 10 yards now, 9, 8. Would she go past without looking up? Then their eyes met. She had hazel eyes, but Mr. Lewisham, being quite an amateur about eyes, could find no words for them. She looked demurely into his face. She seemed to find nothing there. She glanced away from him among the trees, and passed, and nothing remained in front of him but an empty avenue, a sunlit, green-shot void. The incident was over. From far away the soughing of the breeze swept towards him, and in a moment all the twigs about him were quivering and rustling, and the boughs creaking with a gust of wind. It seemed to urge him away from her. The faded dead leaves that had once been green and young sprang up, raced one another, leapt, danced and pirouetted, and then something large struck him on the neck, stayed for a startling moment, and drove past him up the avenue. something vividly white, a sheet of paper, the sheet upon which she had been writing. For what seemed a long time he did not grasp the situation. He glanced over his shoulder and understood suddenly. His awkwardness vanished. Horace in hand, he gave chase, and in 10 paces had secured the fugitive document. He turned towards her, flushed with triumph, the quarry in his hand. He had, as he picked it up, seen what was written, but the situation dominated him for the instant. He made a stride towards her, and only then understood what he had seen. Lines of a measured length and capitals. Could it really be? He stopped. He looked again, eyebrows rising. He held it before him, staring now quite frankly. It had been written with a stylographic pen. Thus it ran: "Come, sharp's the word," and then again, "Come, sharp's the word," and then, "Come, sharp's the word, come, sharp's the word," and so on all down the page, in a boyish hand, uncommonly like Frobisher II's. Surely. "I say," said Mr. Lewisham, struggling with the new aspect and forgetting all his manners in his surprise. He remembered giving the imposition quite well. Frobisher II had repeated the exhortation just a little too loudly, had brought the thing upon himself. To find her doing this jarred oddly upon certain vague preconceptions he had formed of her. Somehow it seemed as if she had betrayed him. That, of course, was only for the instant. She had come up with him now. "May I have my sheet of paper, please?" she said, with a catching of her breath. She was a couple of inches less in height than he. "Do you observe her half-open lips?" said Mother Nature in a noiseless aside to Mr. Lewisham, a thing he afterwards recalled. In her eyes was a touch of apprehension. "I say," he said, with protest still uppermost, "you oughtn't to do this." "Do what?" "This. Impositions for my boys." She raised her eyebrows, then knitted them momentarily, and looked at him. "Are you Mr. Lewisham?" she asked, with an affectation of entire ignorance and discovery. She knew him perfectly well, which was one reason why she was writing the imposition, but pretending not to know gave her something to say. Mr. Lewisham nodded. "Of all people! Then, frankly, you've just found me out." "I'm afraid I have," said Lewisham. "I am afraid I have found you out." They looked at one another for the next move. She decided to plead in extenuation. "Teddy Frobisher is my cousin. I know it's very wrong, but he seemed to have such a lot to do, and to be in such trouble. And I had nothing to do. In fact, it was I who offered." She stopped and looked at him. She seemed to consider her remark complete. That meeting of the eyes had an oddly disconcerting quality. He tried to keep to the business of the imposition. "You ought not to have done that," he said, encountering her steadfastly. She looked down and then into his face again. "No," she said, "I suppose I ought not to. I'm very sorry." Her looking down and up again produced another unreasonable effect. It seemed to Lewisham that they were discussing something quite other than the topic of their conversation, a persuasion patently absurd and only to be accounted for by the general disorder of his faculties. He made a serious attempt to keep his footing of reproof. "I should have detected the writing, you know." "Of course you would. It was very wrong of me to persuade him. But I did, I assure you. He seemed in such trouble. And I thought..." She made another break, and there was a faint deepening of colour in her cheeks. Suddenly, stupidly, his own adolescent cheeks began to glow. It became necessary to banish that sense of a duplicate topic forthwith. "I can assure you," he said now very earnestly, "I never give her a punishment, never, unless it is merited. I make that a rule. I always make that a rule. I am very careful indeed." "I am really sorry," she interrupted with frank contrition. It was silly of me." Lewisham felt unaccountably sorry that she should have to apologise, and he spoke at once with the idea of checking the reddening of his face. "I don't think that," he said with a sort of belated alacrity. "Really, it was kind of you, you know, very kind of you indeed. And I know that, I can quite understand that your kindness ran away with me. And now poor little Teddy will get into worse trouble for letting me." "Oh no," said Mr. Lewisham, perceiving an opportunity and trying not to smile his appreciation of what he was saying. "I had no business to read this as I picked it up. Absolutely no business. Consequently " "You won't take any notice of it? Really?" "Certainly not," said Mr. Lewisham. Her face lit with a smile, and Mr. Lewisham's relaxed in sympathy. "It is nothing. It's the proper thing for me to do, you know." "But so many people won't do it. Schoolmasters are not usually so chivalrous." He was chivalrous. The phrase acted like a spur. He obeyed a foolish impulse. "If you like," he said. "What?" "He needn't do this. The I mean, I'll let him off." "Really?" "I can." "It's awfully kind of you." "I don't mind," he said. "It's nothing much. If you really think..." He was full of self-applause for this scandalous sacrifice of justice. "It's awfully kind of you," she said. "It's nothing really," he explained. "Nothing." "Most people wouldn't..." "I know." Pause. "It's all right," he said. "Really." He would have given worlds for something more to say, something witty and original, but nothing came. The pause lengthened. She glanced over her shoulder down the vacant avenue. This interview, this momentous series of things unsaid, was coming to an end. She looked at him hesitatingly and smiled again. She held out her hand. No doubt that was the proper thing to do. He took it, searching a void, tumultuous mind in vain. "It's awfully kind of you," she said again as she did so. "It don't matter a bit," said Mr. Lewisham, and sought vainly for some other saying, some doorway remark into new topics. Her hand was cool and soft and firm, the most delightful thing to grasp, and this observation ousted all other things. He held it for a moment, but nothing would come. They discovered themselves hand in hand. They both laughed and felt silly. They shook hands in the manner of quite intimate friends, and snatched their hands away awkwardly. She turned, glanced timidly at him over her shoulder, and hesitated. "Good bye," she said, and was suddenly walking from him. He bowed to her receding back, made a 17th century sweep with his college cap, and then some hitherto unexplored regions of his mind flashed into revolt. Hardly had she gone 6 paces when he was at her side again. "I say," he said, with a fearful sense of his temerity, and raising his mortar-board awkwardly as though he was passing a funeral. "But that sheet of paper..." "Yes," she said, surprised, quite naturally. "May I have it?" "Why?" He felt a breathless pleasure, like that of sliding down a slope of snow. "I would like to have it." She smiled and raised her eyebrows, but his excitement was now too great for smiling. "Look here," she said, and displayed the sheet crumpled into a ball. She laughed, with a touch of effort. "I don't mind that," said Mr. Lewisham, laughing too. He captured the paper by an insistent gesture and smoothed it out with fingers that trembled. "You don't mind?" he said. "Mind what?" "If I keep it." "Why should I?" Pause. Their eyes met again. There was an odd constraint about both of them, a palpitating interval of silence. "I really must be going," she said suddenly, breaking the spell by an effort. She turned about and left him with the crumpled piece of paper in the fist that held the book, the other hand lifting the mortar-board in a dignified salute again. He watched her receding figure. His heart was beating with remarkable rapidity. How light, how living she seemed! Little round flakes of sunlight raced down her as she went. She walked fast, then slowly, looking sideways once or twice, but not back, until she reached the park gates. Then she looked towards him, a remote, friendly little figure, made a gesture of farewell, and disappeared. His face was flushed and his eyes bright. Curiously enough, he was out of breath. He stared for a long time at the vacant end of the avenue. Then he turned his eyes to his trophy gripped against the closed and forgotten Horace in his hand. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Love and Mr Lewisham by H.G. Wells. This LibreVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anthony Ogus. The wonderful discovery. On Sunday it was Lewisham's duty to accompany the boarders twice to church. The boys sat in the gallery above the choirs, facing the organ loft and at right angles to the general congregation. It was a prominent position, and made him feel painfully conspicuous, except in moods of exceptional vanity, when he used to imagine that all these people were thinking how his forehead and his certificates accorded. He thought a lot in those days of his certificates and forehead, but little of his honest, healthy face beneath it. To tell the truth, there was nothing very wonderful about his forehead. He rarely looked down the church, as he fancied to do so would be to meet the collective eye of the congregation regarding him, so that in the morning he was not able to see that the Frobishers' pew was empty until the litany. But in the evening, on the way to church, the Frobishers and their guest crossed the market square as his string of boys marched along the west side, and the guest was arrayed in a gay new dress, as if it was already Easter, and her face set in its dark hair came with a strange effect of mingled freshness and familiarity. She looked at him calmly. He felt very awkward, and was for cutting his new acquaintance, then hesitated and raised his hat with a jerk as if to Mrs. Frobisher. Neither lady acknowledged his salute, which may possibly have been a little unexpected. Then young Siddons dropped his hymn book, stooped to pick it up, and Lewisham almost fell over him. He entered church in a mood of black despair. But consolation of a sort came soon enough. As she took her seat, she distinctly glanced up at the gallery, and afterwards, as he knelt to pray, he peeped between his fingers and saw her looking up again. She certainly was not laughing at him. In those days much of Lewisham's mind was still an unknown land to him. He believed, among other things, that he was always the same consistent, intelligent human being, whereas under certain stimuli he became no longer reasonable and disciplined, but a purely imaginative and emotional person. Music, for instance, carried him away, and particularly the effect of many voices in unison whirled him off from almost any state of mind to a fine massive emotionality. And the evening service at Whortley Church, at the evening service surplices were worn, the chanting and singing, the vague brilliance of the numerous candle flames, the multitudinous unanimity of the congregation down there, kneeling, rising, thunderously responding, invariably inebriated him, inspired him, if you will, and turned the prose of his life into poetry. And chance, coming to the aid of Dame Nature, dropped just the apt suggestion into his now highly responsive ear. The second hymn was a simple and popular one, dealing with a theme of faith, hope, and charity, and having each verse ending with the word love. Conceive it, long drawn out and disarticulate: faith will vanish into sight, hope be emptied in delight, love in heaven will shine more bright, therefore give us love. At the third repetition of the refrain, Lewisham looked down across the chancel and met her eyes for a brief instant. He stopped singing abruptly. Then the consciousness of the serried ranks of faces below there came with almost overwhelming force upon him, and he dared not look at her again. He felt the blood rushing to his face. Love, the greatest of these, the greatest of all things, better than fame, better than knowledge. So came the great discovery, like a flood across his mind, pouring over it with the cadence of the hymn, and sending a tide of pink in sympathy across his forehead. The rest of the service was phantasmagorial background to that great reality, a phantasmagorial background a little inclined to stare. He, Mr Lewisham, was in love. Amen. He was so preoccupied that he found the whole congregation subsiding into their seats, and himself still standing, rapt. He sat down spasmodically, with an impact that seemed to him to re-echo through the church. As they came out of the porch into the thickening night, he seemed to see her everywhere. He fancied she had gone on in front, and he hurried up the boys in the hope of overtaking her. They pushed through the throng of dim people going homeward. Should he raise his hat to her again? But it was Susie Hopbrow in a light-coloured dress, a raven in dove's plumage. He felt a curious mixture of relief and disappointment. He would see her no more that night. He hurried from the school to his lodging. He wanted very urgently to be alone. He went upstairs to his little room and sat before the upturned box on which his butler's analogy was spread open. He did not go to the formality of lighting the candle. He leant back and gazed blissfully at the solitary planet that hung over the vicarage garden. He took out of his pocket a crumpled sheet of paper, smoothed and carefully refolded, covered with a writing not unlike that of Frobisher too, and after some maidenly hesitation pressed this treasure to his lips. The schema and the timetable hung in the darkness like the mere ghosts of themselves. Mrs. Munday called him thrice to his supper. He went out immediately after it was eaten, and wandered under the stars until he came over the hill behind the town again, and clambered up the back to the stile in sight of the Frobishers' house. He selected the only lit window as hers. Behind the blind, Mrs. Frobisher, 38, was busy with her curl papers (she used papers because they were better for the hair), and discussing certain neighbours in a fragmentary way with Mr. Frobisher, who was in bed. Presently she moved the candle to examine a faint discoloration of her complexion that rendered her uneasy. Outside, Mr. Lewisham, 18, stood watching the orange oblong for the best part of half an hour, until it vanished and left the house black and blank. Then he sighed deeply and returned home in a very glorious mood indeed. He awoke the next morning feeling extremely serious, but not clearly remembering the overnight occurrences. His eye fell on his clock. The time was 6, and he had not heard the alarum. As a matter of fact, the alarum had not been wound up. He jumped out of bed at once, and alighted upon his best trousers, amorphously dropped on the floor instead of methodically cast over a chair. As he soaped his head, he tried, according to his rules of revision, to remember the overnight reading. He could not for the life of him. The truth came to him as he was getting into his shirt. His head, struggling in its recesses, became motionless. The handless cuffs ceased to dangle for a minute. Then his head came through slowly, with a surprised expression upon his face. He remembered. He remembered the thing as a bald discovery, and without a touch of emotion, with all the achromatic clearness, the unromantic colourless of the early morning. Yes, he had it now quite distinctly. There had been no overnight reading. He was in love. The proposition jarred with some vague thing in his mind. He stood staring for a space, and then began looking about absent-mindedly for his collar stud. He paused in front of his schema, regarding it. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Love and Mr Lewisham by H. G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anthony Ogus. Raised eyebrows. "Work must be done anyhow," said Mr Lewisham. But never had the extraordinary advantages of open-air study presented themselves so vividly. Before breakfast he took half an hour of open-air reading along the allotments lane near the Frobishers' house. After breakfast and before school he went through the avenue with a book, and returned from school to his lodgings circuitously through the avenue, and so back to the avenue for 30 minutes or so before afternoon school. When Mr Lewisham was not looking over the top of his book during these periods of open-air study, then commonly he was glancing over his shoulder. And at last who should he see but? He saw her out of the corner of his eye, and he turned away at once, pretending not to have seen her. His whole being was suddenly irradiated with emotion. The hands holding his book gripped it very tightly. He did not glance back again, but walked slowly and steadfastly, reading an ode that he could not have translated to save his life, and listening acutely for her approach. And after an interminable time, as it seemed, came a faint footfall and the swish of skirts behind him. He felt as though his head was directed forward by a clutch of iron. "Mr Lewisham," she said close to him, and he turned with a quality of movement that was almost convulsive. He raised his cap clumsily. He took her extended hand by an afterthought, and held it until she withdrew it. "I'm so glad to have met you," she said. "So am I," said Lewisham simply. They stood facing one another for an expressive moment, and then by a movement she indicated her intention to walk along the avenue with him. "I wanted so much," she said, looking down at her feet, "to thank you for letting Teddy off, you know. That is why I wanted to see you." Lewisham took his first step beside her. "And it's odd, isn't it," she said, looking up into his face, "that I should meet you here, in just the same place. I believe yes, the very same place we met before." Mr Lewisham was tongue-tied. "Do you often come here?" she said. "Well," he considered, and his voice was most unreasonably hoarse when he spoke. No, that is, at least not often. Now and then. In fact, I like it rather for reading and that sort of thing. It's so quiet." "I suppose you read a great deal." "When one teaches, one has to. But you—" "I'm rather fond of reading, certainly. Are you?" "I love it." Mr Lewisham was glad she loved reading. He would have been disappointed had she answered differently. But she spoke with real fervour. She loved reading. It was pleasant. She would understand him a little, perhaps. "Of course," she went on, "I'm not clever like some people are, and I have to read books as I get hold of them." "So do I," said Mr Lewisham. "For the matter of that, have you read Carlyle?" The conversation was now fairly under way. They were walking side by side beneath the swaying boughs. Mr Lewisham's sensations were ecstatic, marred only by a dread of some casual boy coming upon them. She had not read much Carlyle. She had always wanted to, even from quite a little girl. She had heard so much about him. She knew he was a really great writer, a very great writer indeed. All she had read of him she liked. She could say that. As much as she liked anything. And she had seen his house in Chelsea. Lewisham, whose knowledge of London had been obtained by excursion trips on 6 or 7 isolated days, was much impressed by this. It seemed to put her at once on a footing of intimacy with this imposing personality. It had never occurred to him at all vividly that these great writers had real abiding places. She gave him a few descriptive touches that made the house suddenly real and distinctive to him. She lived quite near, she said, at least within walking distance, in Clapham. He instantly forgot the vague design of lending her his Sartor Resartus in his curiosity to learn more about her home. "Clapham, that's almost in London, isn't it?" he said. "Quite," she said, but she volunteered no further information about her domestic circumstances. "I like London," she generalised, "and especially in winter." And she proceeded to praise London, its public libraries, its shops, the multitudes of people, the facilities for doing what you like, the concerts one could go to, the theatres. It seemed she moved in fairly good society. "There's always something to see, even if you only go out for a walk," she said. "And down here there's nothing to read but idle novels, and those not new." Mr Lewisham had regretfully to admit the lack of such culture and mental activity in Whortley. It made him feel terribly her inferior. He had only his bookishness and his certificates to set against it all, and she had seen Carlyle's house. "Down here," she said, "there's nothing to talk about but scandal." It was too true. At the corner by the stile, beyond which the willows were splendid against the blue, with silvery aments and golden pollen, they turned by mutual impulse and retraced their steps. "I've simply had no one to talk to down here," she said. "Not what I called talking." "I hope," said Lewisham, making a resolute plunge, "perhaps while you are staying at Whortley." He paused perceptibly, and she, following his eyes, saw a voluminous black figure approaching. "We may," said Mr Lewisham, resuming his remark, "chance to meet again, perhaps." He had been about to challenge her to a deliberate meeting. A certain delightful tangle of paths that followed the bank of the river had been in his mind. But the apparition of Mr George Bonover, headmaster of the Whortley Proprietary School, chilled him amazingly. Dame Nature no doubt had arranged the meeting of our young couple, but about Bonover she seems to have been culpably careless. She now receded inimitably, and Mr Lewisham, with the most unpleasant feelings, found himself face to face with a typical representative of a social organisation which objects very strongly, inter alia, to promiscuous conversation on the part of the young unmarried junior master. "Chance to meet again, perhaps," said Mr Lewisham, with a sudden lack of spirit. "I hope so too," she said. Pause. Mr Bonover's features, and particularly a bushy pair of black eyebrows, were now very near, those eyebrows already raised, apparently to express a refined astonishment. "Is this Mr Bonover approaching?" she asked. "Yes." Prolonged pause. Would he stop and accost them? At any rate this frightful silence must end. Mr Lewisham sought in his mind for some remark wherewith to cover his employer's approach. He was surprised to find his mind a desert. He made a colossal effort. If they could only talk, if they could only seem at their ease! But this blank incapacity was eloquent of guilt. Ah! "It's a lovely day, though," said Mr Lewisham, "isn't it?" She agreed with him. "Isn't it?" she said. And then Mr Bonover passed, forehead tight reefed, so to speak, and lips impressively compressed. Mr Lewisham raised his mortarboard, and to his astonishment Mr Bonover responded with a markedly formal salute, mock clerical hat sweeping circuitously, and the regard of a searching disapproving eye, and so passed. Lewisham was overcome with astonishment at this improvement on the nod of their ordinary commerce. And so this terrible incident terminated for the time. He felt a momentary gust of indignation. After all, why should Bonover or any one interfere with his talking to a girl if he chose? And for all he knew they might have been properly introduced by young Frobisher, say. Nevertheless, Lewisham's springtide mood relapsed into winter. He was, he felt, singularly stupid for the rest of their conversation, and the delightful feeling of enterprise that had hitherto inspired and astonished him when talking to her had shrivelled beyond contempt. He was glad, positively glad, when things came to an end. At the park gate she held out her hand. "I'm afraid I have interrupted your reading," she said. "Not a bit," said Mr Lewisham, warming slightly. "I don't know when I've enjoyed a conversation. It was "A breach of etiquette, I'm afraid, my speaking to you, but I did so want to thank you." "Don't mention it," said Mr. Lewisham, secretly impressed by the etiquette. "Good bye." He stood hesitating by the lodge, and then turned back up the avenue in order not to be seen to follow her too closely up the West Street. And then, still walking away from her, he remembered that he had not lent her a book as he had planned, nor made any arrangement ever to meet her again. She might leave Whortley anywhen for the amenities of Clapham. He stopped and stood irresolute. Should he run after her? Then he recalled Bonover's enigmatical expression of face. He decided that to pursue her would be altogether too conspicuous. Yet... So he stood in inglorious hesitation while the seconds passed. He reached his lodging at last, to find Mrs. Munday half-way through dinner. "You get them books of yours," said Mrs. Munday, who took a motherly interest in him, "and you read, and you take no account of time. And now you have to eat your dinner half cold, and no time for it to settle proper before you goes off to school. It's ruination to a stomach, such ways." "Oh, never mind my stomach, Mrs. Munday," said Lewisham, roused from a tangled and apparently gloomy meditation. "That's my affair." Quite crossly he spoke for him. "I'd rather have a good sensible acting stomach than a full head," said Mrs. Munday. "Any day." "I'm different, you see," snapped Mr. Lewisham, and relapsed into silence and gloom. "Hoity-toity," said Mrs. Munday under her breath. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Love and Mr. Lewisham by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anthony Ogus. Hesitations. Mr. Bonover, having fully matured a hint suitable for the occasion, dropped it in the afternoon while Lewisham was superintending cricket practice. He made a few remarks about the prospects of the first 11 by way of introduction, and Lewisham agreed with him that Frobisher 1 looked like shaping very well this season. A pause followed, and the headmaster hummed. "By the by," he said, as if making conversation, and still watching the play, "I understood that you were a stranger to Whortley." "Yes," said Lewisham, "that's so." "You have made friends in the neighbourhood?" Lewisham was troubled with a cough, and his ears, those confounded ears, brightened. "Yes," he said, recovering. "Oh yes, yes, I have." "Local people, I presume?" "Well, no, not exactly." The brightness spread from Lewisham's ears over his face. "I saw you," said Bonover, "talking to a young lady in the avenue. Her face was somehow quite familiar to me. Who was she?" Should he say she was a friend of the Frobishers? In that case Bonover, in his insidious amiable way, might talk to the Frobisher parents and make things disagreeable for her. "She was," said Lewisham, flushing deeply with the stress on his honesty and dropping his voice to a mumble, "an old friend of my mother's. In fact, I met her once at Salisbury." "Where?" "Salisbury." "And her name?" "Smith," said Lewisham a little hastily, and repenting the lie even as it left his lips. "Well hit, Harris!" shouted Bonover, and began to clap his hands. "Well hit, sir!" "Harris shapes very well," said Mr. Lewisham. "Very," said Mr. Bonover. "And what was it? I was just remarking the odd resemblances there are in the world. There is a Miss Henderson, or Henson, stopping with the Frobishers, in the very same town. In fact, the very picture of your Miss..." "Smith," said Lewisham, meeting his eye and recovering the full crimson note of his first blush. "It's odd," said Bonover, regarding him pensively. "Very odd," mumbled Lewisham, cursing his own stupidity and looking away. "Very, very odd," said Bonover. "In fact," said Bonover, turning towards the schoolhouse, "I hardly expected of you, Mr Lewisham." "Expected what, sir?" But Mr. Bonover feigned to be already out of earshot. "Damn," said Mr. Lewisham. "Oh, damn." A most objectionable expression, and rare with him in those days. He had half a mind to follow the headmaster and ask him if he doubted his word. It was only too evident what the answer would be. He stood for a minute undecided, then turned on his heel and marched homeward with savage steps. His muscles quivered as he walked, and his face twitched. The tumult of his mind settled at last into angry indignation. "Confound him," said Mr. Lewisham, arguing the matter out with the bedroom furniture. "Why the devil can't he mind his own business?" "Mind your own business, sir," shouted Mr. Lewisham at the wash-hand stand. "Confound you, sir, mind your own business." The wash-hand stand did. "You overrate your power, sir," said Mr. Lewisham, a little mollified. "Understand me? I am my own master out of school." Nevertheless, for 4 days and some hours after Mr. Bonover's hint, Mr. Lewisham so far observed its implications as to abandon open-air study and struggle with diminishing success to observe the spirit as well as the letter of his timetable prescriptions. For the most part he fretted at accumulating tasks, did them with slipshod energy, or looked out of window. The Career constituent insisted that to meet and talk to this girl again meant reproof, worry, interference with his work for his matriculation, the destruction of all discipline, and he saw the entire justice of the insistence. It was nonsense, this being in love. There wasn't such a thing as love outside of trashy novelettes. And forthwith his mind went off at a tangent to her eyes under the shadow of her hat brim, and had to be lugged back by main force. On Thursday, when he was returning from school, he saw her far away down the street, and hurried in to avoid her, looking ostentatiously in the opposite direction. But that was a turning point. Shame overtook him. On Friday his belief in love was warm and living again, and his heart full of remorse for laggard days. On Saturday morning his preoccupation with her was so vivid that it distracted him even while he was teaching that most teachable subject, algebra, and by the end of the school hours the issue was decided, and the Career in headlong rout. That afternoon he would go, whatever happened, and see her, and speak to her again. The thought of Bonover arose only to be dismissed, and besides, Bonover took a siesta early in the afternoon. Yes, he would go out and find her and speak to her. Nothing should stop him. Once that decision was taken, his imagination became riotous with things he might say, attitudes he might strike, and a multitude of vague fine dreams about her. He would say this, he would say that, his mind would do nothing but circle round this wonderful pose of lover. What a cur he had been to hide from her so long! What could he have been thinking about? How could he explain it to her when the meeting really came? Suppose he was very frank. He considered the limits of frankness. Would she believe he had not seen her on Thursday, if he assured her that it was so? And most horrible, in the midst of all this came Bonover with a request that he take duty in the cricket field instead of Dunkerley that afternoon. Dunkerley was the senior assistant master, Lewisham's sole colleague. The last vestige of disapprobation had vanished from Bonover's manner. Asking a favour was his autocratic way of proffering the olive branch. But it came to Lewisham as a cruel imposition. For a fateful moment he trembled on the brink of acquiescence. In a flash came a vision of the long duty of the afternoon. She possibly packing for Clapham all the while. He turned white. Mr. Bonover watched his face. "No," said Lewisham bluntly, saying all he was sure of, and forthwith racking his unpractised mind for an excuse. I'm sorry, I can't oblige you, but I've made arrangements, in fact, for the afternoon." Mr. Bonover's eyebrows went up at this obvious lie, and the glow of his suavity faded. "You see," he said, "Mrs. Bonover expects a friend this afternoon, and we rather want Mr. Dunkerley to make 4 at croquet." "I'm sorry," said Mr. Lewisham, still resolute, and making a mental note that Bonover would be playing croquet. "You don't play croquet by any chance?" asked Bonover. "No," said Lewisham. "I haven't an idea." "If Mr. Dunkerley had asked you," persisted Bonover, knowing Lewisham's respect for etiquette. "Oh, it wasn't on that account," said Lewisham. And Bonover, with eyebrows still raised and a general air of outraged astonishment, left him standing there, white and stiff, and wondering at his extraordinary temerity. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Love and Mr. Lewisham by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anthony Ogus. The Scandalous Ramble. As soon as school was dismissed, Lewisham made a jail delivery of his outstanding impositions and hurried back to his lodgings to spend the time until his dinner was ready. Well, it seems hardly fair perhaps to Lewisham to tell this. It is doubtful indeed whether a male novelist's duty to his sex should not restrain him. But as the wall in the shadow by the diamond-framed window insisted, magna est veritas et prevalebit. Mr. Lewisham brushed his hair with elaboration and ruffled it picturesquely, tried the effect of all his ties and selected a white one, dusted his boots with an old pocket-handkerchief, changed his trousers because the weekday pair was minutely frayed at the heels, and inked the elbows of his coat where the stitches were a little white. And to be still more intimate, he studied his callow appearance in the glass from various points of view, and decided that his nose might have been a little smaller with advantage. Directly after dinner he went out, and by the shortest path to the allotment lane, telling himself he did not care if he met Bonover forthwith in the street. He did not know precisely what he intended to do, but he was quite clear that he meant to see the girl he had met in the avenue. He knew he should see her. A sense of obstacles merely braced him and was pleasurable. He went up the stone steps out of the lane to the stile that overlooked the Frobishers, the stile from which he had watched the Frobisher bedroom. There he seated himself with his arms folded in full view of the house. That was at 10 minutes to 2. At 20 minutes to 3 he was still sitting there, but his hands were deep in his jacket pockets, and he was scowling and kicking his foot against the step with an impatient monotony. His needless glasses had been thrust into his waistcoat pocket, where they remained throughout the afternoon, and his cap was tilted a little back from his forehead and exposed a wisp of hair. 1 or 2 people had gone down the lane, and he had pretended not to see them, and a couple of hedge sparrows chasing each other along the side of the sunlit, wind-rippled field had been his chief entertainment. It is unaccountable, no doubt, but he felt angry with her as the time crept on. His expression lowered. He heard someone going by in the lane behind him. He would not look round. It annoyed him to think of people seeing him in this position. His once eminent discretion, though overthrown, still made muffled protests at the afternoon's enterprise. The feet down the lane stopped close at hand. "Stare away," said Lewisham between his teeth, and then began mysterious noises, a violent rustle of hedge twigs, a something like a very light foot tapping. Curiosity boarded Lewisham and carried him after the briefest struggle. He looked round, and there she was, her back to him, reaching after the spiky blossoming blackthorn that crested the opposite hedge. Remarkable accident. She had not seen him. In a moment Lewisham's legs were flying over the stile. He went down the steps in the bank with such impetus that it carried him up into the prickly bushes beside her. "Allow me," he said, too excited to see she was not astonished. "Mr Lewisham," she said in feigned surprise, and stood away to give him room at the blackthorn. "Which spike will you have?" he cried, overjoyed. "The whitest? The highest? Any?" "That piece," she chose haphazard, "with the black spike sticking out from it." A mass of snowy blossom it was against the April sky, and Lewisham, straggling for it, it was by no means the most accessible, saw with fantastic satisfaction a lengthy scratch flash white on his hand, and turn to red. "Higher up the lane," he said, descending triumphant and breathless, "there is blackthorn. This cannot compare for a moment." She laughed and looked at him as he stood there flushed, his eyes triumphant with an unpremeditated approval. In church, in the gallery, with his face foreshortened, he had been effective in a way, but this was different. "Show me," she said, though she knew this was the only place for blackthorn for a mile in either direction. "I knew I should see you," he said by way of answer. "I felt sure I should see you today." "It was our last chance almost," she answered with as frank a quality of avowal. "I'm going home to London on Monday." "I knew!" he cried in triumph. "To Clapham?" he asked. "Yes, I have got a situation. You did not know that I was a shorthand clerk and typewriter, did you? I am. I have just left the school, the Grogram school, and now there is an old gentleman who wants an amanuensis." "So you know shorthand," said he. "That accounts for the stylographic pen. Those lines were written. I have them still." She smiled and raised her eyebrows. "Here," said Mr Lewisham, tapping his breast pocket. "This lane," he said. Their talk was curiously inconsecutive. "Some way along this lane, over the hill and down, there is a gate, and that goes, I mean, it opens into the path that runs along the river bank. Have you been?" "No," she said. "It's the best walk about Whortley. It brings you out upon Immering Common. You must, before you go." "Now?" she said, with her eyes dancing. "Why not?" "I told Mrs Frobisher I should be back by 4, she said. "It's a walk not to be lost." "Very well," said she. "The trees are all budding," said Mr Lewisham. "The rushes are shooting, and all along the edge of the river there are millions of little white flowers floating on the water. I don't know the names of them, but they're fine. May I carry that branch of blossom?" As he took it their hands touched momentarily, and there came another of those significant gaps. "Look at those clouds," said Lewisham abruptly, remembering the remark he had been about to make, and waving the white froth of blackthorn. "And look at the blue between them. It's perfectly splendid. Of all the fine weather the best has been kept for now. My last day. My very last day." And off these two young people went together in a highly electrical state, to the infinite astonishment of Mrs Frobisher, who was looking out of the attic window, stepping out manfully and finding the whole world lit and splendid for their entertainment. The things they discovered and told each other that afternoon down by the river, that spring was wonderful, young leaves beautiful, bud scales astonishing things, and clouds dazzling and stately, with an air of supreme originality, and their naive astonishment to find one another in agreement upon these novel delights. It seemed to them quite outside the play of accident that they should have met each other. They went by the path that runs among the trees along the river bank, and she must needs repent and wish to take the lower one, the towing path, before they had gone 300 yards. So Lewisham had to find a place fit for her descent, where a friendly tree proffered its protruding roots as a convenient balustrade, and down she clambered, with her hand in his. Then a water vole washing his whiskers gave occasion for a sudden touching of hands, and the intimate confidence of whispers and silence together. After which Lewisham essayed to gather her a marshmallow at the peril, as it was judged, of his life, and gained it together with a bootful of water. And at the gate by the black and shiny lock, where the path breaks away from the river, she overcame him by an unexpected feat, climbing gleefully to the top rail with the support of his hand, and leaping down, a figure of light and grace, to the ground. They struck boldly across the meadows, which were gay with ladies' smock, and he walked, by special request, between her and 3 matronly cows, feeling as Perseus might have done when he fended off the sea monster. And so by the mill, and up a steep path to Immering Common. Across the meadows Lewisham had broached the subject of her occupation. "And are you really going away from here to be an amanuensis?" he said, and started her upon the theme of herself, a theme she treated with a specialist's enthusiasm. They dealt with it by the comparative methods, and neither noticed the light was out of the sky until the soft feet of the advancing shower had stolen right upon them. "Look," said he, "yonder, a shed," and they ran together. She ran laughing, and yet swiftly and lightly. He pulled her through the hedge by both hands, and released her skirt from an amorous bramble, and so they came into a little black shed, in which a rusty harrow of gigantic proportions sheltered. He noted how she still kept her breath after that run. She sat down on the harrow and hesitated. "I must take off my hat," she said. "That rain will spoil it." And so he had a chance of admiring the sincerity of her curls, not that he had ever doubted them. She stooped over her hat, pocket handkerchief in hand, daintily wiping off the silvery drops. He stood up at the opening of the shed and looked at the country outside through the veil of the soft vehemence of the April shower. "There's room for 2 on this harrow," she said. He made inarticulate sounds of refusal, and then came and sat down beside her, close beside her, so that he was almost touching her. He felt a fantastic desire to take her in his arms and kiss her, and overcame the madness by an effort. "I don't even know your name," he said, taking refuge from his whirling thoughts in conversation. "Henderson," she said. "Miss Henderson?" She smiled in his face, hesitated. "Yes, Miss Henderson." Her eyes, her atmosphere were wonderful. He had never felt quite the same sensation before, a strange excitement, almost like a faint echo of tears. He was for demanding her Christian name, for calling her dear, and seeing what she would say. He plunged headlong into a rambling description of Bonover, and how he had told a lie about her and called her Miss Smith, and so escaped this unaccountable emotional crisis. The whispering of the rain about them sank and died, and the sunlight struck vividly across the distant woods beyond Immering. Just then they had fallen on a silence again that was full of daring thoughts for Mr Lewisham. He moved his arm suddenly and placed it so that it was behind her on the frame of the harrow. "Let us go on now," she said abruptly. "The rain has stopped." "That little path goes straight to Immering," said Mr Lewisham. "But 4 o'clock?" He drew out his watch, and his eyebrows went up. It was already nearly 4:15. "Is it past 4?" she asked, and abruptly they were face to face with parting. That Lewisham had to take duty at 5:30 seemed a thing utterly trivial. "Surely," he said, only slowly realising what this parting meant. "But must you I want to talk to you." "Haven't you been talking to me?" "It isn't that. Besides, no." She stood looking at him. "I promised to be home by 4," she said. Mrs. Frobisher has tea. We may never have a chance to see one another again. Well." Lewisham suddenly turned very white. "Don't leave me," he said, breaking a tense silence, and with a sudden stress in his voice. "Don't leave me. Stop with me yet, for a little while. You can lose your way." "You seem to think," she said, forcing a laugh, "that I live without eating and drinking." "I've wanted to talk to you so much. The first time I saw you, at first I dared not. I did not know that you would let me talk. And now, just as I am happy, you are going." He stopped abruptly. Her eyes were downcast. "No," she said, tracing a curve with the point of her shoe. "No, I am not going." Lewisham restrained an impulse to shout. "You will come to Immering?" he cried, and as they went along the narrow path through the wet grass, he began to tell her with simple frankness how he cared for her company. "I would not change this," he said, casting about for an offer to reject, for anything in the world. "I shall not be back for duty. I don't care. I don't care what happens, so long as we have this afternoon." "Nor I," she said. "Thank you for coming," he said in an outburst of gratitude. "Oh, thank you for coming," and held out his hand. She took it and pressed it, and so they went on hand in hand until the village street was reached. Their high resolve to play truant at all costs had begotten a wonderful sense of fellowship. "I can't call you Miss Henderson," he said. "You know I can't. You know I must have your Christian name." "Ethel," she told him. "Ethel," he said, and looked at her, gathering courage as he did so. "Ethel," he repeated. "It is a pretty name, but no name is quite pretty enough for you, Ethel. Dear." The little shop in Immering lay back behind a garden full of wallflowers, and was kept by a very fat and very cheerful little woman, who insisted on regarding them as brother and sister, and calling them both dearie. These points conceded, she gave them an admirable tea of astonishing cheapness. Lewisham did not like the second condition very much, because it seemed to touch a little on his latest enterprise. But the tea and the bread and butter and the wort jam were like no food on earth. There were wallflowers, heavily scented, in a jug upon the table, and Ethel admired them, and when they set out again the little old lady insisted on her taking a bunch with her. It was after they left Immering that this ramble, properly speaking, became scandalous. The sun was already a golden ball above the blue hills in the west. It turned our two young people into little figures of flame, and yet instead of going homeward they took the Wentworth road that plunges into the Foreshore woods. Behind them the moon, almost full, hung in the blue sky above the tree tops, ghostly and indistinct, and slowly gathered to itself such light as the setting sun left for it in the sky. Going out of Immering they began to talk of the future, and for the very young lover there is no future but the immediate future. "You must write to me," he said, and she told him she wrote such silly letters. "But I shall have reams to write to you," he told her. "How are you to write to me?" she asked, and they discussed a new obstacle between them. It would never do to write home, never. She was sure of that with an absolute assurance. "My mother," she said, and stopped. That prohibition cut him, for at that time he had the makings of a voluminous letter writer. Yet it was only what one might expect. The whole world was unpropitious, obdurate indeed, a splendid isolation à deux. Perhaps she might find some place where letters might be sent to her. Yet that seemed to her deceitful. So these two young people wandered on, full of their discovery of love, and yet so full too of the shyness of adolescence that the word love never passed their lips that day. Yet as they talked on, and the kindly dusk gathered about them, Their speech and their hearts came very close together. But their speech would seem so threadbare, written down in cold blood, that I must not put it here. To them it was not threadbare. When at last they came down the long road into Whortley, the silent trees were black as ink, and the moonlight made her face pallid and wonderful, and her eyes shone like stars. She still carried the blackthorn from which most of the blossoms had fallen. The fragrant wallflowers were fragrant still. And far away, softened by the distance, the Whortley band, performing publicly outside the vicarage for the first time that year, was playing with unctuous slowness a sentimental air. I don't know if the reader remembers it, that favourite melody of the early 80s. Sweet dreamland faces, passing to and fro, pum pum, bring back to memory days of long ago, oh, oh, was the essence of it. Very slow and tender, and with an accompaniment of pum pum. Pathetically cheerful, that pum pum, hopelessly cheerful indeed, against the dirge of the air, a dirge accentuated by sporadic vocalisation. But to young people things come differently. "I love music," she said. "So do I," said he. They came on down the steepness of West Street. They walked athwart the metallic and leathery tumult of sound into the light cast by the little circle of yellow lamps. Several people saw them and wondered what the boys and girls were coming to nowadays, and one eye-witness even subsequently described their carriage as brazen. Mr. Lewisham was wearing his mortarboard cap of office. There was no mistaking him. They passed the proprietary school and saw a yellow picture framed and glazed of Mr. Bonover taking duty for his aberrant assistant master. And outside the Frobisher house at last they parted perforce. "Good bye," he said for the third time. "Good bye, Ethel." She hesitated. Then suddenly she darted towards him. He felt her hands upon his shoulders, her lips soft and warm upon his cheek, and before he could take hold of her she had eluded him and had flitted into the shadow of the house. "Good bye," came her sweet clear voice out of the shadow, and while he yet hesitated an answer, the door opened. He saw her, black in the doorway, heard some indistinct words, and then the door closed, and he was alone in the moonlight, his cheek still glowing from her lips. So ended Mr. Lewisham's first day with love. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Love and Mr. Lewisham by H. G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anthony Ogus. The Reckoning. And after the day of love came the days of reckoning. Mr. Lewisham was astonished, overwhelmed almost, by that reckoning, as it slowly and steadily unfolded itself. The wonderful emotions of Saturday carried him through Sunday, and he made it up with the neglected Schema by assuring it that she was his inspiration, and that he would work for her 1,000 times better than he could possibly work for himself. That was certainly not true, and indeed he found himself wondering whither the interest had vanished out of his theological examination of Butler's Analogy. The Frobishers were not at church for either service. He speculated rather anxiously why. Monday dawned coldly and clearly, a Herbert Spencer of a day, and he went to school sedulously assuring himself there was nothing to apprehend. Day boys were whispering in the morning apparently about him, and Frobisher too was in great request. Lewisham overheard a fragment. "My mother was in a wax," said Frobisher too. At 12 came an interview with Bonover, and voices presently rising in angry altercation and audible to Senior Assistant Dunkerley through the closed study door. Then Lewisham walked across the schoolroom, staring straight before him, his cheeks very bright. Thereby Dunkley's mind was prepared for the news that came the next morning over the exercise books. "When?" said Dunkley. "End of next term," said Lewisham. "About this girl that's been staying at the Frobishers?" "Yes." "She's a pretty bit of goods, but it will mess up your matric next June," said Dunkley. "That's what I'm sorry for." "It's scarcely to be expected he'll give you leave to attend the exam." "He won't," said Lewisham shortly, and opened his first exercise book. He found it difficult to talk. "He's a greaser," said Dunkley. "But there, what can you expect from Durham?" For Bonover had only a Durham degree, and Dunkley, having none, inclined to be particular. Therewith Dunkley lapsed into a sympathetic and busy rustling over his own pile of exercises. It was not until the heap had been reduced to a book or so that he spoke again, an elaborate point. "Male and female created he them," said Dunkley, ticking his way down the page, "which, tick tick, was damned hard, tick tick, on assistant masters." He closed the book with a snap and flung it on the floor behind him. "You're lucky," he said. "I did think I should be first to get out of this scandalising hole. You're lucky. It's always acting down here, running on parents and guardians round every corner. That's what I object to in life in the country. It's so confoundedly artificial. I shall take jolly good care I get out of it just as soon as ever I can, you bet." "And work those patents?" "Rather, my boy. Yes, work those patents. The patent square top bottle, Lord, once let me get to London." "I think I shall have a shot at London," said Lewisham. And then the experienced Dunkley, being one of the kindest young men alive, forgot certain private ambitions of his own (he cherished dreams of amazing patents), and bethought him of agents. He proceeded to give a list of these necessary helpers of the assistant master at the gangway, Orellana, Gabbitas, the Lancaster Gate Agency, and the rest of them. He knew them all, intimately. He had been a Nix 8 years. "Of course that Kensington thing may come off," said Dunkley, "but it's best not to wait. I tell you frankly, the chances are against you." The Kensington thing was an application for admission to the Normal School of Science at South Kensington, which Lewisham had made in a sanguine moment. There being an inadequate supply of qualified science teachers in England, the Science and Art Department is wont to offer free instruction at its great central school and a guinea a week to select young pedagogues who will bind themselves to teach science after their training is over. Dunkley had been in the habit of applying for several years, always in vain, and Lewisham had seen no harm in following his example. But then Dunkley had no green-grey certificates. So Lewisham spent all that duty left him of the next day composing a letter to copy out and send the several scholastic agencies. In this he gave a brief but appreciative sketch of his life, and enlarged upon his discipline and educational methods. At the end was a long and decorative schedule of his certificates and distinctions, beginning with a Good Conduct Prize at the age of 8. A considerable amount of time was required to recopy this document, but his modesty upheld him. After a careful consideration of the timetable, he set aside the midday hour for correspondence. He found that his work in mathematics and classics was already some time in arrears, and a test he had sent to his correspondence tutor during those troublous days after the meeting with Bonover in the Avenue came back blottesquely endorsed below past standard. This last experience was so unprecedented and annoyed him so much that for a space he contemplated retorting with a sarcastic letter to the tutor. And then came the Easter recess, and he had to go home and tell his mother, with a careful suppression of details, that he was leaving Whortley. "Where you've been getting on so well," cried his mother. But that dear old lady had one consolation. She observed he had given up his glasses, he had forgotten to bring them with him, and her secret fear of grave optical troubles that were being kept from her was alleviated. Sometimes he had moods of intense regret for the folly of that walk. One such came after the holidays, when the necessity of revising the dates of the Schema brought before his mind, for the first time quite clearly, the practical issue of this first struggle with all those mysterious and powerful influences the springtime sets a-stirring. His dream of success and fame had been very real and dear to him, and the realisation of the inevitable postponement of his long-anticipated matriculation, the doorway to all the other great things, took him abruptly like an actual physical sensation in his chest. He sprang up, pen in hand, in the midst of his corrections, and began pacing up and down the room. "What a fool I've been!" he cried. "What a fool I've been!" He flung the pen on the floor and made a rush at an ill-drawn attempt upon a girl's face that adorned the end of his room, the visible witness of his slavery. He tore this down and sent the fragments of it scattering. Fool! It was a relief, a definite abandonment. He stared for a moment at the destruction he had made, and then went back to the revision of the timetable, with a mutter about silly spooning. That was one mood, the rarer one. He watched the posts with far more eagerness for the address to which he might write to her than for any reply to those reiterated letters of application, the writing of which now ousted Horace and the higher mathematics, Lewisham's terms for conics, from his attention. Indeed, he spent more time meditating the letter to her than even the schedule of his virtues had required. Yet the letters of application were wonderful compositions. Each had a new pen to itself, and was, for the first page at least, in a handwriting far above even his usual high standard. And day after day passed, and that particular letter he hoped for still did not come. His moods were complicated by the fact that, in spite of his studied reticence on the subject, the reason of his departure did, in an amazingly short time, get all over Whortley. It was understood that he had been discovered to be fast, and Ethel's behaviour was animadverted upon with complacent indignation, if the phrase may be allowed, by the ladies of the place. Pretty looks were too often a snare. One boy, his ear was warmed therefore, once called aloud "Ethel" as Lewisham went by. The curate, a curate of the pale-faced, large-knuckled, nervous sort, now passed him without acknowledgment of his existence. Mrs. Bonover took occasion to tell him that he was a mere boy, and once Mrs. Frobisher sniffed quite threateningly at him when she passed him in the street. She did it so suddenly she made him jump. This general disapproval inclined him at times to depression, but in certain moods he found it exhilarating, and several times he professed himself to Dunkerley not a little of a blade. In others he told himself he bore it for her sake. Anyhow, he had to bear it. He began to find out, too, how little the world feels the need of a young man of 19 (he called himself 19, though he had several months of 18 still to run), even though he adds prizes for good conduct, general improvement and arithmetic, an advanced certificate signed by a distinguished engineer and headed with the Royal Arms, guaranteeing his knowledge of geometrical drawing, nautical astronomy, animal physiology, physiography, inorganic chemistry and building construction to his youth and strength and energy. At first he had imagined headmasters clutching at the chance of him, and presently he found himself clutching eagerly at them. He began to put a certain urgency into his applications for vacant posts, an urgency that helped him not at all. The applications grew longer and longer until they ran to 4 sheets of note paper, a pennyworth in fact. "I can assure you," he would write, "that you will find me a loyal and devoted assistant," much in that strain. Dunkerley pointed out that Bonover's testimonial ignored the question of moral character and discipline in a marked manner, and Bonover refused to alter it. He was willing to do what he could to help Lewisham, in spite of the way he had been treated, but unfortunately his conscience. Once or twice Lewisham misquoted the testimonial, to no purpose, and May was half-way through, and South Kensington was silent. The future was grey. And in the depths of his doubt and disappointment came her letter. It was typewritten on thin paper. "Dear," she wrote simply, and it seemed to him the most sweet and wonderful of all possible modes of address, though as a matter of fact it was because she had forgotten his Christian name, and afterwards forgotten the blank she had left for it. "Dear, I could not write before because I have no room at home now where I can write a letter, and Mrs. Frobisher told my mother falsehoods about you. My mother has surprised me dreadfully. I did not think it of her. She told me nothing, but of that I must tell you in another letter. I'm too angry to write about it now. Even now you cannot write back, for you must not send letters here. It would never do. But I think of you, dear," the dear had been erased and rewritten, "and I must write and tell you so, and of that nice walk we had, if I never write again. I am very busy now. My work is rather difficult, and I am afraid I am a little stupid. It is hard to be interested in anything just because that is how you have to live, is it not? I dare say you sometimes feel the same of school, but I suppose everybody is doing things they don't like. I don't know when I shall come to Whortley again, if ever, but very likely you will be coming to London. Mrs. Frobisher said the most horrid things. It would be nice if you could come to London, because then perhaps you might see me. There is a big boys' school at Chelsea, and when I go by it every morning I wish you were there. Then you would come out in your cap and gown as I went by. Suppose some day I was to see you there suddenly." So it ran, with singularly little information in it, and ended quite abruptly. "Good bye, dear. Good bye, dear," scribbled in pencil, and then, "think of me sometimes." Reading it, and especially that opening "dear," made Lewisham feel the strangest sensation in his throat and chest, almost as though he was going to cry. So he laughed instead, and read it again, and went to and fro in his little room with his eyes bright and that precious writing held in his hand. That "dear" was just as if she had spoken, a voice suddenly heard. He thought of her farewell, clear and sweet, out of the shadow of the moonlit house. But why that "if I never write again," and that abrupt ending? Of course he would think of her. It was her only letter. In a little time its creases were worn through. Early in June came a loneliness that suddenly changed into almost intolerable longing to see her. He had vague dreams of going to London, to Clapham, to find her. But you do not find people in Clapham as you do in Whortley. He spent an afternoon writing and rewriting a lengthy letter against the day when her address should come, if it was to come. He prowled about the village disconsolately, and at last set off about 7, and retraced by moonlight almost every step of that one memorable walk of theirs. In the blackness of the shed he worked himself up to the pitch of talking as if she were present, and he said some fine brave things. He found the little old lady of the wallflowers with a candle in her window, and drank a bottle of ginger beer with a sacramental air. The little old lady asked him, a trifle archly, after his sister, and he promised to bring her again some day. "I'll certainly bring her," he said. Talking to the little old lady somehow blunted his sense of desolation. And then home through the white indistinctness in a state of melancholy that became at last so fine as to be almost pleasurable. The day after that mood a new text attracted and perplexed Mrs. Munday, an inscription at once mysterious and familiar, and this inscription was Mizpah. It was in Old English lettering, and evidently very carefully executed. Where had she seen it before? It quite dominated all the rest of the room at first. It flaunted like a flag of triumph over discipline and the timetable and the schema. Once, indeed, it was taken down, but the day after it reappeared. Later a list of scholastic vacancies partially obscured it, and some pencil memoranda were written on the margin. And when at last the time came for him to pack up and leave Whortley, he took it down and used it with several other suitable papers, the Schema and the Timetable were its next door neighbours, to line the bottom of the yellow box in which he packed his books, chiefly books for that matriculation that had now to be postponed. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Love and Mr Lewisham by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anthony Ogus. The career prevails. There is an interval of 2 years and a half, and the story resumes with a much maturer Mr Lewisham, indeed no longer a youth but a man, a legal man, at any rate of 21 years. Its scene is no longer little Whortley, embedded among its trees, ruddy banks, parks and common land, but the grey spaciousness of West London. And it does not resume with Ethel at all, for that promised second letter never reached him, and though he spent many an afternoon during his first few months in London wandering about Clapham, that arid waste of people, the meeting that he longed for never came, until at last, after the manner of youth, so gloriously recuperative in body, heart and soul, he began to forget. The quest of a crib had ended in the unexpected fruition of Dunkerley's blue paper. The green-blue certificates had, it seemed, a value beyond mural decoration, and when Lewisham was already despairing of any employment for the rest of his life, came a marvellous blue document from the Education Department promising inconceivable things. He was to go to London and be paid a guinea a week for listening to lectures beyond his most ambitious dreams. Among the names that swang before his eyes was Huxley and then Lockyer. What a chance to get! Is it any wonder that for 3 memorable years the career prevailed with him? You figure him on his way to the Normal School of Science at the opening of his 3rd year of study there. They call the place the Royal College of Science in these latter days. He carried in his right hand a shiny black bag, well stuffed with textbooks, notes, and apparatus for the forthcoming session. And in his left was a book that the bag had no place for, a book with gilt edges, and its binding very carefully protected by a brown paper cover. The lapse of time had asserted itself upon his upper lip in an inaggressive but indisputable moustache, in an added inch or so of stature, and in his less conscious carriage. For he no longer felt that universal attention he believed in at 18. It was beginning to dawn on him, indeed, that quite a number of people were entirely indifferent to the fact of his existence. But if less conscious, his carriage was decidedly more confident, as of one with whom the world goes well. His costume was, with one exception, a tempered black, mourning put to hard uses and cutting up rusty. The mourning was for his mother, who had died more than a year before the date when this story resumes, and had left him property that capitalized at nearly £100, a sum which Lewisham hoarded jealously in the savings bank, paying only for such essentials as university fees and the books and instruments his brilliant career as a student demanded. For he was having a brilliant career after all, in spite of the Whortley cheque, licking up paper certificates indeed like a devouring flame. Surveying him, madam, your eye would inevitably have fallen to his collar, curiously shiny, a surface like wet gum. Although it has practically nothing to do with this story, I must, I know, dispose of that before I go on, or you will be inattentive. London has its mysteries, but this strange gloss on his linen. "Cheap laundresses always make your things blue," protests the lady. "It ought to have been blue stained, generously frayed, and loose about the button, fretting his neck. But this gloss!" You would have looked nearer, and finally you would have touched a charnel house surface, dank and cool. You see, madam, the collar was a patent waterproof one of those you wash overnight with a toothbrush, and hang on the back of your chair to dry, and there you have it next morning, rejuvenesced. It was the only collar he had in the world. It saved threepence a week at least, and that, to a South Kensington science teacher in training, living on the guinea a week allowed by a parental but parsimonious government, is a sum to consider. It had come to Lewisham as a great discovery. He had seen it first in a shop window full of india rubber goods, and it lay at the bottom of a glass bowl in which goldfish drifted discontentedly to and fro, and he told himself that he rather liked that gloss. But the wearing of a bright red tie would have been unexpected, a bright red tie after the fashion of a South Western Railway Guards. The rest of him by no means dandiacal, even the vanity of glasses long since abandoned. You would have reflected, where had you seen a crowd, red ties abundant and in some way significant? The truth has to be told. Mr Lewisham had become a socialist. That red tie was indeed but one outward and visible sign of much inward and spiritual development. Lewisham, in spite of the demands of a studious career, had read his Butler's Analogy through by this time, and some other books. He had argued, had had doubts, and called upon God for faith in the silence of the night, faith to be delivered immediately if Mr Lewisham's patronage was valued, and which nevertheless was not so delivered. And his conception of his destiny in this world was no longer an avenue of examinations to a remote bar and political eminence in the Liberal interest. He had begun to realise certain aspects of our social order that Whortley did not demonstrate, begun to feel something of the dull stress deepening to absolute wretchedness and pain, which is the colour of so much human life in modern London. One vivid contrast hung in his mind symbolical. On the one hand were the Coleys of the Westbourne Park yards, on strike and gaunt and hungry, children begging in the black slush, and starving loungers outside a soap kitchen. And on the other, Westbourne Grove, 2 streets further, a blazing array of crowded shops, a stirring traffic of cabs and carriages, and such a spate of spending that a tired student in leaky boots and graceless clothes, hurrying home, was continually impeded in the whirl of skirts and parcels and sweetly pretty womanliness. And on the other, Westbourne Grove, 2 streets further, a blazing array of crowded shops, a stirring traffic of cabs and carriages, and such a spate of spending that a tired student in leaky boots and graceless clothes, hurrying home, was continually impeded in the whirl of skirts and parcels and sweetly pretty womanliness. No doubt the tired student's own inglorious sensations pointed the moral, but that was only one of a perpetually recurring series of vivid approximations. Lewisham had a strong persuasion, an instinct it may be, that human beings should not be happy while others near them were wretched, and this gay glitter of prosperity had touched him with a sense of crime. He still believed people were responsible for their own lives. In those days he had still to gauge the possibilities of moral stupidity in himself and his fellow men. He happened upon Progress and Poverty just then, and some casual numbers of the Common Weal, and it was only too easy to accept the theory of cunning plotting capitalists and landowners and faultless righteous martyr workers. He became a socialist forthwith. The necessity to do something at once to manifest the new faith that was in him was naturally urgent. So he went out and, historical moment, bought that red tie. "Blood colour, please," said Lewisham meekly to the young lady at the counter. "What colour?" said the young lady at the counter sharply. "A bright scarlet, please," said Lewisham, blushing. And he spent the best part of the evening and much of his temper in finding out how to tie this into a neat bow. It was a plunge into novel handicraft, for previously he had been accustomed to made-up ties. So it was that Lewisham proclaimed the social revolution. The first time that symbol went abroad, A string of stalwart policemen were walking in single file along the Brompton Road. In the opposite direction marched Lewisham. He began to hum. He passed the policeman with a significant eye and humming the Marseillaise. But that was months ago, and by this time the red tie was a thing of use and wont. He turned out of the Exhibition Road through a gateway of wrought iron and entered the hall of the Normal School. The hall was crowded with students carrying books, bags and boxes of instruments, students standing and chattering, students reading the framed and glazed notices of the Debating Society, students buying notebooks, pencils, rubber or drawing pins from the privileged stationer. There was a strong representation of new hands, the paying students, youths and young men in black coats and silk hats or tweed suits, the scholar contingent, youngsters of Lewisham's class, raw, shabby, discordant, grotesquely ill-dressed and awe-stricken. One Lewisham noticed with a sailor's peaked cap, gold decorated, and one with mittens and very genteel grey kid gloves. And Grummett, the perennial official of the books, was busy among them. "Der Socialist," said a wit. Lewisham pretended not to hear, and blushed vividly. He often wished he did not blush quite so much, seeing he was a man of 21. He looked studiously away from the Debating Society notice board, whereon G.E. Lewisham on Socialism was announced for the next Friday, and struggled through the hall to where the book awaited his signature. Presently he was hailed by name, and then again. He could not get to the book for a minute or so because of the handshaking and clumsy friendly jests of his fellow men. He was pointed out to a raw hand by the raw hand's experienced fellow townsman as "that beast Lewisham, awful swot. He was second last year on the year's work. Frightful mugger. But all these swots have a touch of the beastly prig. Exams, Debating Society, more exams. Don't seem to have ever heard of being alive. Never goes near a music hall from one year's end to the other." Lewisham heard a shrill whistle, made a run for the lift and caught it just on the point of departure. The lift was unlit and full of black shadows. Only the sapper who conducted it was distinct. As Lewisham peered doubtfully at the dim faces near him, a girl's voice addressed him by name. "Is that you, Miss Heydinger?" he answered. "I didn't see. I hope you have had a pleasant vacation." End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Love and Mr Lewisham by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anthony Ogus. Alice Heydinger. When he arrived at the top of the building he stood aside for the only remaining passenger to step out before him. It was the Miss Heydinger who had addressed him, the owner of that gilt-edged book in the cover of brown paper. No one else had come all the way up from the ground floor. The rest of the load in the lift had emerged at the astronomical and chemical floors, but these two had both chosen zoology for their third year of study, and zoology lived in the attics. She stepped into the light with a rare touch of colour springing to her cheeks in spite of herself. Lewisham perceived an alteration in her dress. Perhaps she was looking for and noticed the transitory surprise in his face. The previous session, their friendship was now nearly a year old, it had never once dawned upon him that she could possibly be pretty. The chief thing he had been able to recall with any definiteness during the vacation was that her hair was not always tidy, and that even when it chanced to be so, she was nervous about it, she distrusted it. He remembered her gesture while she talked, a patting exploration that verged on the exasperating. From that he went on to remember that its colour was on the whole fair, a light brown. But he had forgotten her mouth, he had failed to name the colour of her eyes. She wore glasses, it is true, and her dress was indefinite in his memory, an amorphous dinginess. And yet he had seen a good deal of her. They were not in the same course, but he had made her acquaintance on the committee of the school debating society. Lewisham was just then discovering socialism. That had afforded a basis of conversation, an incentive to intercourse. She seemed to find something rarely interesting in his peculiar view of things, and, as chance would have it, he met her accidentally quite a number of times, in the corridors of the schools, in the big education library, and in the art museum. After a time those meetings appear to have been no longer accidental. Lewisham, for the first time in his life, began to fancy he had conversational powers. She resolved to stir up his ambitions, an easy task. She thought he had exceptional gifts, and that she might serve to direct them. She certainly developed his vanity. She had matriculated at the London University, and they took the intermediate examination in science together in July, she a little unwisely, which served, as almost anything will serve in such cases, as a further link between them. She failed, which in no way diminished Lewisham's regard for her. On the examination days they discoursed about friendship in general and things like that down the Burlington Arcade during the lunch time. Burlington Arcade undisguisedly amused by her learned dinginess and his red tie. And among other things that were said, she reproached him for not reading poetry. When they parted in Piccadilly after the examination, they agreed to write about poetry and themselves during the holidays, and then she lent him, with a touch of hesitation, Rossetti's poems. He began to forget what had at first been very evident to him, that she was 2 or 3 years older than he. Lewisham spent the vacation with an unsympathetic but kindly uncle who was a plumber and builder. His uncle had a family of 6, the eldest 11, and Lewisham made himself agreeable and instructive. Moreover, he worked hard for the culminating 3rd year of his studies, in which he had decided to do great things, and he learnt to ride the ordinary bicycle. He also thought about Miss Heydinger, and she, it would seem, thought about him. He argued on social questions with his uncle, who was a prominent local Conservative. His uncle's controversial methods were coarse in the extreme. Socialists, he said, were thieves. The object of socialism was to take away what a man earned and give it to a lot of lazy scoundrels. Also, rich people were necessary. If they weren't well-off people, how do you think I'd get a living, eh? And where'd you be then? Socialism, his uncle assured him, was got up by agitators. They get money out of young gabbies like you, and they spend it in champagne. And thereafter he met Mr Lewisham's arguments with the word champagne uttered in an irritating voice, followed by a luscious pantomime of drinking. Naturally Lewisham felt a little lonely, and perhaps he laid stress upon it in his letters to Miss Heydinger. It came to light that she felt rather lonely too. They discussed the question of true as distinguished from ordinary friendship, and from that they passed to Goethe and elective affinities. He told her how he looked for her letters, and they became more frequent. Her letters were indisputably well written. Had he been a journalist with a knowledge of per thou, he would have known each for a day's work. After the practical plumber had been asking what he expected to make by this here science of his, re-reading her letters was balsamic. He liked Rossetti. The exquisite sense of separation in the Blessed Damsel touched him. But on the whole he was a little surprised at Miss Heydinger's taste in poetry. Rossetti was so sensuous, so florid. He had scarcely expected that sort of thing. Altogether he had returned to the schools decidedly more interested in her than when they had parted, and the curious vague memories of her appearance as something little frayed and careless vanished at sight of her emerging from the darkness of the lift. Her hair was in order, as the light glanced through it looked even pretty, and she wore a well-made dark green and black dress, loose gathered as was the fashion in those days, that somehow gave a needed touch of warmth to her face. Her hat, too, was a change from the careless lumpishness of last year, a hat that, to a feminine mind, would have indicated design. It suited her. These things are past a male novelist's explaining. "I have this book of yours, Miss Heydinger," he said. "I'm glad you have written that paper on socialism," she replied, taking the brown-covered volume. They walked along the little passage towards the biological laboratory side by side, and she stopped at the hat pegs to remove her hat. For that was the shameless way of the place. A girl student had to take her hat off publicly, and publicly assume the holland apron that was to protect her in the laboratory. Not even a looking-glass. "I shall come and hear your paper," she said. "I hope you'll like it," said Lewisham at the door of the laboratory. "And in the vacation I've been collecting evidence about ghosts. You remember our arguments, though I did not tell you in my letters." "I'm sorry you're still obdurate," said Lewisham. "I thought that was over." "And have you read Looking Backward?" "I want to." "I have it here with my other books, if you'd care for me to lend it to you. Wait till I reach my table. My hands are so full." They entered the laboratory together, Lewisham holding the door open courtly-wise, Miss Heydinger taking a reassuring pat at her hair. Near the door was a group of 4 girls, which group Miss Heydinger joined, holding the brown-covered book as inconspicuously as possible. 3 of them had been through the previous 2 years with her, and they greeted her by her Christian name. They had previously exchanged glances at her appearance in Lewisham's company. A morose elderly young demonstrator brightened momentarily at the sight of Lewisham. "Well, we've got one of the decent ones anyhow," said the morose elderly young demonstrator, who was apparently taking an inventory and then brightening at a fresh entry. "Ah, and here's Smithers." End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Love and Mr Lewisham by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anthony Ogus. In the Gallery of Old Iron. As one goes into the South Kensington Art Museum from the Brompton Road, the Gallery of Old Iron is overhead to the right, but the way thither is exceedingly devious and not to be revealed to everybody, since the young people who pursue science and art thereabouts set a peculiar value on its seclusion. The gallery is long and narrow and dark, and set with iron gates, iron-bound chests, locks, bolts and bars, fantastic great keys, lamps and the like, and over the balustrade one may lean and talk of one's finer feelings and regard Michelangelo's Horned Moses, or Trajan's column in plaster rising gigantic out of the hall below, and far above the level of the gallery. And here on a Wednesday afternoon were Lewisham and Miss Heydinger, the Wednesday afternoon immediately following that paper upon socialism that you saw announced on the notice board in the hall. The paper had been an immense success, closely reasoned, delivered with a disciplined emotion, the redoubtable Smithers practically converted, the reply after the debate methodical and complete, and it may be there were symptoms of that febrile affection known to the vulgar as swelled head. Lewisham regarded Moses and spoke of his future. Miss Heydinger, for the most part, watched his face. "And then," said Miss Heydinger, "one must bring these views prominently before people. I believe still in pamphlets. I have thought." Lewisham paused, it is to be hoped through modesty. "Yes," said Miss Heydinger. "Well, Luther, you know. There is room, I think, in socialism for a Luther." "Yes," said Miss Heydinger, imagining it. "Yes, that would be a grand way." So it seemed to many people in those days, but eminent reformers have been now for more than 7 years going about the walls of the social Jericho, blowing their own trumpets and shouting, with such small result beyond incidental displays of ill temper within, that it is hard to recover the fine hopefulness of those departed days. "Yes," said Miss Heydinger, "that would be a grand way." Lewisham appreciated the quality of personal emotion in her voice. He turned his face towards her, and saw unstinted admiration in her eyes. "It would be a great thing to do," he said, and added quite modestly, If only one could do it." "You could do it?" "You think I could?" Lewisham blushed vividly, with pleasure. "I do. Certainly you could set out to do it. Even to fail hopelessly would be great. Sometimes " She hesitated. He looked expectation. "I think sometimes it is greater even to fail than to succeed." "I don't see that," said the proposed Luther, and his eyes went back to the Moses. She was about to speak, and changed her mind. Contemplative pause. "And then, when a great number of people have heard of your views," she said presently. "Then I suppose we must form a party and bring things about." Another pause, full no doubt of elevated thoughts. "I say," said Lewisham quite suddenly, "you do put, well, courage into a chap. I shouldn't have done that socialism paper if it hadn't been for you." He turned round and stood leaning with his back to the Moses and smiling at her. "You do help a fellow," he said. That was one of the vivid moments of Miss Heydinger's life. She changed colour a little. "Do I?" she said, standing straight and awkward and looking into his face. "I'm glad." "I haven't thanked you for your letters," said Lewisham, "and I've been thinking." "Yes?" "We're first-rate friends, aren't we? The best of friends." She held out her hand and drew a breath. "Yes," she said, as they gripped. He hesitated whether to hold her hand. He looked into her eyes, and at that moment she would have given 3/4 of the years she had still to live to have had eyes and features that could have expressed her. Instead, she felt her face hard, the little muscles of her mouth twitching insubordinate, and fancied that her self-consciousness made her eyes dishonest. "What I mean," said Lewisham, "is that this will go on. We're always going to be friends side by side." "Always. Just as I am able to help you, I will help you. However I can help you, I will." "We too," said Lewisham, gripping her hand. Her face lit. Her eyes were for a moment touched with the beauty of simple emotion. "We too," she said, and her lips trembled and her throat seemed to swell. She snatched her hand back suddenly and turned her face away. Abruptly she walked towards the end of the gallery, and he saw her fumbling for her handkerchief in the folds of the green and black dress. She was going to cry. It set Lewisham marvelling, this totally inappropriate emotion. He followed her and stood by her. Why cry? He hoped no one would come into the little gallery until her handkerchief was put away. Nevertheless, he felt vaguely flattered. She controlled herself, dashed her tears away, and smiled bravely at him with reddened eyes. "I'm sorry," she said, gulping. "I am so glad," she explained. "But we will fight together, we two. I can help you, I know I can help you, and there is such work to be done in the world." "You're very good to help me," said Lewisham, quoting a phrase from what he had intended to say before he found out that he had a hold upon her emotions. "No." "Has it ever occurred to you," she said abruptly, "how little a woman can do alone in the world?" "Or a man," he answered after a momentary meditation. So it was Lewisham enrolled his first ally in the cause of the red tie, of the red tie and of the greatness that was presently to come. His first ally, for hitherto, save for the indiscretion of his mural inscriptions, he had made a secret of his private ambitions. In that now half forgotten love affair at Whortley even, he had, in spite of the considerable degree of intimacy attained, said absolutely nothing about his career. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Love and Mr Lewisham by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anthony Ogus. Manifestations. Miss Heydinger declined to disbelieve in the spirits of the dead, and this led to controversy in the laboratory over tea. For the girl students, being in a majority that year, had organised tea between 4 o'clock and the advent of the extinguishing policeman at 5. And the men students were occasionally invited to tea, but not more than 2 of them at a time really participated, because there were only 2 spare cups, after that confounded Simmons broke the 3rd. Smithers, the square-headed student with the hard grey eyes, argued against the spirits of the dead with positive animosity, while Bletherley, who displayed an orange tie and lank hair in unshorn abundance, was vaguely open-minded. "What is love?" asked Bletherley. "Surely that, at any rate, is immortal." His remark was considered irrelevant and ignored. Lewisham, as became the most promising student of the year, weighed the evidence comprehensively under headings. He dismissed the mediumistic séances as trickery. "Rotten imposture," said Smithers loudly, and with an oblique glance to see if his challenge reached its mark. Its mark was a grizzled little old man with a very small face and very big grey eyes, who had been standing listlessly at one of the laboratory windows until the discussion caught him. He wore a brown velvet jacket and was reputed to be enormously rich. His name was Lagune. He was not a regular attendant, but one of those casual outsiders who are admitted to laboratories that are not completely full. He was known to be an ardent spiritualist. It was even said that he had challenged Huxley to a public discussion on materialism, and he came to the biological lectures and worked intermittently, in order, he explained, to fight disbelief with its own weapons. He rose greedily to Smithers' controversial bait. "I say no," he said, cooling down the narrow laboratory and following his voice. He spoke with the ghost of a lisp. "Pardon my interrupting, sir. The question interests me profoundly. I hope I don't intrude. Excuse me, sir. Make it personal. Am I a fool or an impostor?" "Well," parried Smithers, with all a South Kensington student's want of polish, "that's a bit personal." "Assume, sir, that I am an honest observer." "Well?" "I have seen spirits, heard spirits, felt the touch of spirits." He opened his pale eyes very widely. "Fool, then," said Smithers in an undertone, which did not reach the ears of the spiritualist. "You may have been deceived," paraphrased Lewisham. "I can assure you others can see, hear, feel. I have tested, sir. Tested. I have some scientific training, and I have employed tests. Scientific and exhaustive tests. Every possible way. I ask you, sir, have you given the spirits a chance?" "It's only paying guineas to humbugs," said Smithers. "There you are. Prejudice. Here is a man denies the facts, and consequently won't see them, won't go near them." "But you wouldn't have every man in the 3 kingdoms who disbelieved in spirits attend séances before he should be allowed to deny?" "Most assuredly, yes. Most assuredly, yes. He knows nothing about it till then." The argument became heated. The little old gentleman was soon under way. He knew a person of the most extraordinary gifts, a medium. "Paid?" asked Smithers. "Would you muzzle the ox that tradeth out the corn?" said Lagune promptly. Smithers' derision was manifest. "Would you distrust a balance because you bought it? Come and see." Lagune was now very excited and inclined to gesticulate and raise his voice. He invited the whole class incontinently to a series of special séances. "Not all at once. The spirit's new influences." "But in sections." "I warn you we may get nothing. But the chances are I would rejoice infinitely." So it came about that Lewisham consented to witness a spirit raising. Miss Heydinger, it was arranged, should be there, and the sceptic Smithers. Lagune, his typewriter, and the medium would complete the party. Afterwards there was to be another party for the others. Lewisham was glad he had the moral support of Smithers. "It's an evening wasted," said Smithers, who had gallantly resolved to make the running for Lewisham in the contest for the Forbes medal. "But I'll prove my case. You see if I don't." They were given an address in Chelsea. The house, when Lewisham found it at last, proved a large one, with such an air of mellow dignity that he was abashed. He hung his hat up for himself beside a green-trimmed hat of straw in the wide, rich-toned hall. Through an open door he had a glimpse of a palatial study, bookshelves bearing white busts, a huge writing-table lit by a green-shaded electric lamp and covered thickly with papers. The housemaid looked, he thought, with infinite disdain at the rusty mourning and flamboyant tie, and flounced about and led him upstairs. She rapped, and there was a discussion within. "They're at it already, I believe," she said to Lewisham confidentially. "Mr. Lagune's always at it." There were sounds of chairs being moved, Smithers' extensive voice making a suggestion and laughing nervously. Lagune appeared, opening the door. His grizzled face seemed smaller and his big grey eyes larger than usual. "We were just going to begin without you," he whispered. "Come along." The room was furnished even more finely than the drawing-room of the Whortley Grammar School, hitherto the finest room, except certain of the state apartments at Windsor, known to Lewisham. The furniture struck him in a general way as akin to that in the South Kensington Museum. His first impression was an appreciation of the vast social superiority of the chairs. It seemed impertinent to think of sitting on anything quite so quietly stately. He perceived Smithers standing with an air of bashful hostility against a bookcase. Then he was aware that Lagune was asking them all to sit down. Already seated at the table was the medium, Chaffery, a benevolent-looking, faintly shabby gentleman with bushy, iron-grey side whiskers, a wide, thin-lipped mouth tucked in at the corners, and a chin like the toe of a boot. He regarded Lewisham critically and disconcertingly over gilt glasses. Miss Heydinger was quite at her ease and began talking at once. Lewisham's replies were less confident than they had been in the gallery of old iron. Indeed, there was almost a reversal of their positions. She led, and he was abashed. He felt obscurely that she had taken an advantage of him. He became aware of another girlish figure in a dark dress on his right. Every one moved towards the round table in the centre of the room, on which lay a tambourine and a little green box. Lagune developed unsuspected lengths of knobbly wrist and finger, directing his guests to their seats. Lewisham was to sit next to him, between him and the medium. Beyond the medium sat Smithers with Miss Heydinger on the other side of him, linked to Lagune by the typewriter. So sceptics compassed the medium about. The company was already seated before Lewisham looked across Lagune and met the eyes of the girl next that gentleman. It was Ethel. The close green dress, the absence of a hat, and a certain loss of colour made her seem less familiar, but did not prevent the instant recognition. And there was recognition in her eyes. Immediately she looked away. At first his only emotion was surprise. He would have spoken, but a little thing robbed him of speech. For a moment he was unable to remember her surname. Moreover, the strangeness of his surroundings made him undecided. He did not know what was the proper way to address her, and he still kept to the superstition of etiquette. Besides, to speak to her would involve a general explanation to all these people. "Just leave a pinpoint of gas, Mr. Smithers, please," said Lagune. And suddenly the one surviving jet of the gas chandelier was turned down, and they were in darkness. The moment for recognition had passed. The joining of hands was punctiliously verified. The circle was linked, little finger to little finger. Lewisham's abstraction received a rebuke from Smithers. The medium, speaking in an affable voice, premised that he could promise nothing, he had no directing power over manifestations. Thereafter ensued a silence. For a space Lewisham was inattentive to all that happened. He sat in the breathing darkness, staring at the dim elusive shape that had presented that remembered face. His mind was astonishment mingled with annoyance. He had settled that this girl was lost to him for ever. The spell of the old days of longing, of the afternoons that he had spent after his arrival in London, wandering through Clapham with a fading hope of meeting her, had not returned to him. But he was ashamed of his stupid silence, and irritated by the awkwardness of the situation. At one moment he was on the very verge of breaking the compact and saying, "Miss Henderson," across the table. How was it he had forgotten that Henderson? He was still young enough to be surprised at forgetfulness. Smithers coughed, one might imagine with a warning intention. Lewisham, recalling his detective responsibility with an effort, peered about him, but the room was very dark. The silence was broken ever and again by deep sighs and a restless stirring from the medium. Out of this mental confusion Lewisham's personal vanity was first to emerge. What did she think of him? Was she peering at him through the darkness, even as he peered at her? Should he pretend to see her for the first time, when the lights were restored? As the minutes lengthened, it seemed as though the silence grew deeper and deeper. There was no fire in the room, and it looked, for lack of that glow, chilly. A curious scepticism arose in his mind as to whether he had actually seen Ethel, or only mistaken someone else for her. He wanted the séance over in order that he might look at her again. The old days at Whortley came out of his memory with astonishing detail, and yet astonishingly free from emotion. He became aware of a peculiar sensation down his back that he tried to account for as a draught. Suddenly a beam of cold air came like a touch against his face and made him shudder convulsively. Then he hoped that she had not marked his shudder. He thought of laughing a low laugh to show he was not afraid. Someone else shuddered too, and he perceived an extraordinarily vivid odour of violets. Lagune's finger communicated a nervous quivering. What was happening? The musical box somewhere on the table began playing a rather trivial, rather plaintive air that was strange to him. It seemed to deepen the silence about him, an accent on the expectant stillness, a thread of tinkling melody spanning an abyss. Lewisham took himself in hand at this stage. What was happening? He must attend. Was he really watching as he should do? He had been wool-gathering. There were no such things as spirits. Mediums were humbugs, and he was here to prove that sole remaining gospel. But he must keep up with things. He was missing points. What was that scent of violets? And who had set the musical box going? The medium, of course, but how? He tried to recall whether he had heard a rustling or detected any movement before the music began. He could not recollect. Come, he must be more on the alert than this. He became acutely desirous of a successful exposure. He figured the dramatic moment he had prepared with Smithers, Ethel a spectator. He peered suspiciously into the darkness. Somebody shuddered again, someone opposite him this time. He felt Lagune's finger quiver still more palpably, and then suddenly the raps began, abruptly, all about him. Rap, making him start violently. A swift percussive sound, tap, rap, dap, under the table, under the chair, in the air, round the cornices. The medium groaned again and shuddered, and his nervous agitation passed sympathetically round the circle. The music seemed to fade to the vanishing point and grew louder again. How was it done? He heard Lagoon's voice next him, speaking with a peculiar quality of breathless reverence. "The alphabet?" he asked. Shall we use the alphabet?" A forcible rap under the table. "No," interpreted the voice of the medium. The raps were continued everywhere. Of course it was trickery. Lewisham endeavoured to think what the mechanism was. He tried to determine whether he really had the medium's little finger touching his. He peered at the dark shape next him. There was a violent rapping far away behind them with an almost metallic resonance. Then the raps ceased, and over the healing silence the little jet of melody from the musical box played alone. And after a moment that ceased also. The stillness was profound. Mr. Lewisham was now highly strung. Doubts assailed him suddenly, and an overwhelming apprehension, a sense of vast occurrences gathering above him. The darkness was a physical oppression. He started. Something had stirred on the table. There was the sharp ping of metal being struck. A number of little crepitating sounds like paper being smoothed. The sound of wind without the movement of air. A sense of a presence hovering over the table. The excitement of Lagune communicated itself in convulsive tremblings. The medium's hand quivered. In the darkness on the table something faintly luminous, a greenish-white patch, stirred and hopped slowly among the dim shapes. The object, whatever it was, hopped higher, rose slowly in the air, expanded. Lewisham's attention followed this slavishly. It was ghostly, unaccountable, marvellous. For the moment he forgot even Ethel. Higher and higher this pallid luminosity rose overhead, and then he saw that it was a ghostly hand and arm, rising, rising. Slowly, deliberately, it crossed the table, seemed to touch Lagune, who shivered. It moved slowly round and touched Lewisham. He gritted his teeth. There was no mistaking the touch, firm and yet soft, of fingertips. Almost simultaneously Miss Heydinger cried out that something was smoothing her hair, and suddenly the musical box set off again with a reel. The faint oval of the tambourine rose, jangled, and Lewisham heard it pat Smithers in the face. It seemed to pass overhead. Immediately a table somewhere beyond the medium began moving audibly on its casters. It seemed impossible that the medium, sitting so still beside him, could be doing all these things, grotesquely unmeaning though they might be. After all, the ghostly hand was hovering almost directly in front of Mr. Lewisham's eyes. It hung with a slight quivering. Ever and again its fingers flapped down and rose stiffly again. Noise. A loud noise, it seemed. Something moving? What was it he had to do? Lewisham suddenly missed the medium's little finger. He tried to recover it. He could not find it. He caught, held and lost an arm. There was an exclamation. A faint report. A curse close to him, bitten in half by the quick effort to suppress it. St! The little pinpoint of light flew up with a hiss. Lewisham, standing, saw a circle of blinking faces turn to the group of two this sizzling light revealed. Smithers was the chief figure of the group. He stood triumphant, one hand on the gas tap, the other gripping the medium's wrist, and in the medium's hand the incriminatory tambourine. "How's this, Lewisham?" cried Smithers, with the shadows on his face jumping as the gas flared. "Caught!" said Lewisham loudly, rising in his place and avoiding Ethel's eyes. "What's this?" cried the medium. "Cheating!" panted Smithers. "Not so," cried the medium. "When you turned up the light, put my hand up, caught tambourine, to save head." "Mr. Smithers!" cried Lagune. "Mr. Smithers! This is very wrong. This shock." The tambourine fell noisily to the floor. The medium's face changed. He groaned strangely and staggered back. Lagune cried out for a glass of water. Every one looked at the man, expecting him to fall, save Lewisham. The thought of Ethel had flashed back into his mind. He turned to see how she took this exposure in which he was such a prominent actor. He saw her leaning over the table as if to pick up something that lay across it. She was not looking at him, she was looking at the medium. Her face was set and white. Then, as if she felt his glance, her eyes met his. She started back, stood erect, facing him with a strange hardness in her eyes. In the moment Lewisham did not grasp the situation. He wanted to show that he was acting upon equal terms with Smithers in the exposure. For the moment her action simply directed his attention to the object towards which she had been leaning, a thing of shrivelled membrane, a pneumatic glove lying on the table. This was evidently part of the mediumistic apparatus. He pounced and seized it. "Look!" he said, holding it towards Smithers. "Here is more. What is this?" He perceived that the girl started. He saw Chaffery the medium look instantly over Smithers' shoulders, saw his swift glance of reproach at the girl. Abruptly the situation appeared to Lewisham. He perceived her complicity. And he stood, still in the attitude of triumph, with the evidence against her in his hand. But his triumph had vanished. "Ah!" cried Smithers, leaning across the table to secure it. "Good old Lewisham! Now we have it! This is better than the tambourine." His eyes shone with triumph. "Do you see, Mr. Lagune?" said Smithers. "The medium held this in his teeth and blew it out. There's no denying this. This wasn't falling on your head, Mr. Medium, was it? This was the luminous hand." End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Love and Mr. Lewisham by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anthony Ogus. Lewisham is unaccountable. That night, as she went with him to Chelsea Station, Miss Heydinger discovered an extraordinary moodiness in Lewisham. She had been vividly impressed by the scene in which they had just participated. She had for a time believed in the manifestations. The swift exposure had violently revolutionised her ideas. The details of the crisis were a little confused in her mind. She ranked Lewisham with Smithers in the scientific triumph of the evening. On the whole she felt elated. She had no objection to being confuted by Lewisham, but she was angry with the medium. "It is dreadful," she said, "living a lie. How can the world grow better when sane, educated people use their sanity and enlightenment to darken others? It is dreadful. He was a horrible man. Such an oily, dishonest voice. And the girl, I was sorry for her. She must have been, oh, bitterly ashamed, or why should she have burst out crying? That did distress me. Fancy crying like that. It was, yes, abandon. But what can one do?" She paused. Lewisham was walking along, looking straight before him, lost in some grim argument with himself. "It makes me think of Sludge the medium," she said. He made no answer. She glanced at him suddenly. "Have you read Sludge the medium?" "Eh?" he said, coming back out of infinity. "What? I beg your pardon. Sludge the medium? I thought his name was... It was Chaffery." He looked at her, clearly very anxious upon this question of fact. "But I mean Browning's Sludge. You know, the poem." "No, I'm afraid I don't," said Lewisham. "I must lend it to you," she said. "It's splendid. It goes to the very bottom of this business." "Does it?" "It never occurred to me before, but I see the point clearly now. If people, poor people, are offered money if phenomena happen, it's too much. They're bound to cheat. It's bribery, immorality." She talked in panting little sentences because Lewisham was walking in heedless big strides. "I wonder how much such people could earn honestly." Lewisham slowly became aware of the question at his ear. He hurried back from infinity. "How much they could earn honestly? I haven't the slightest idea." He paused. "The whole of this business puzzles me," he said. "I want to think." "It's frightfully complex, isn't it?" she said, a little staggered. But the rest of the way to the station was silence. They parted with a hand clasp they took a pride in, a little perfunctory so far as Lewisham was concerned on this occasion. She scrutinised his face as the train moved out of the station, and tried to account for his mood. He was staring before him at unknown things as if he had already forgotten her. He wanted to think. But two heads, she thought, were better than one in a matter of opinion. It troubled her to be so ignorant of his mental states. "How we are wrapped and swathed about, soul from soul," she thought, staring out of the window at the dim things flying by outside. Suddenly a fit of depression came upon her. She felt alone, absolutely alone, in a void world. Presently she returned to external things. She became aware of two people in the next compartment eyeing her critically. Her hand went patting at her hair. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Love and Mr Lewisham by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anthony Ogus. Lewisham insists. Ethel Henderson sat at her machine before the window of Mr Lagoon's study, and stared blankly at the greys and blues of the November twilight. Her face was white, her eyelids were red from recent weeping, and her hands lay motionless in her lap. The door had just slammed behind Lagune. "Hey ho," she said. "I wish I was dead. Oh, I wish I was out of it all." She became passive again. "I wonder what I have done," she said, "that I should be punished like this." She certainly looked anything but a fate-haunted soul, being indeed visibly and immediately a very pretty girl. Her head was shapely and covered with curly dark hair, and the eyebrows above her hazel eyes were clear and dark. Her lips were finely shaped. Her mouth was not too small to be expressive, her chin small, and her neck white and full and pretty. There is no need to lay stress upon her nose, it sufficed. She was of a mediocre height, sturdy rather than slender, and her dress was of a pleasant golden brown material, with the easy sleeves and graceful line of those aesthetic days. And she sat at her typewriter and wished she was dead, and wondered what she had done. The room was lined with bookshelves, and conspicuous therein were a long row of foolish pretentious volumes, the works of Lagune, the witless meandering imitation of philosophy that occupied his life. Along the cornices were busts of Plato, Socrates, and Newton. Behind Ethel was the great man's desk, with its green shaded electric light, and littered with proofs and copies of Hesperus, a paper for doubters, which with her assistance he edited, published, compiled, wrote, and, without her help, paid for and read. A pen flung down forcibly quivered erect with its one surviving nib in the blotting pad. Mr Lagune had flung it down. The collapse of the previous night had distressed him dreadfully, and ever and again before his retreat he had been breaking into passionate monologue. The ruin of a life work it was, no less. Surely she had known that Chaffery was a cheat. Had she not known? Silence. After so many kindnesses. She interrupted him with a wailing. "Oh, I know, I know." But Lagune was remorseless, and insisted she had betrayed him, worse, made him ridiculous. Look at the work he had undertaken at South Kensington. How could he go on with that now? How could he find the heart, when his own typewriter sacrificed him to her stepfather's trickery? Trickery! The gesticulating hands became active, the grey eyes dilated with indignation, the piping voice eloquent. "If he hadn't cheated you, some one else would," was Ethel's inadequate muttered retort, unheard by the seeker after phenomena. It was perhaps not so bad as dismissal, but it certainly lasted longer, and at home was Chaffery, grimly malignant at her failure to secure that pneumatic glove. He had no right to blame her, he really had not, but a disturbed temper is apt to falsify the scales of justice. The tambourine, he insisted, he could have explained by saying he put up his hand to catch it and protect his head directly Smithers moved. But the pneumatic glove there was no explaining. He had made a chance for her to secure it when he had pretended to faint. It was rubbish to say any one could have been looking on the table then. Rubbish. Beside that significant wreck of a pen stood a little carriage clock in a case, and this suddenly lifted a slender voice and announced 5. She turned round on her stool and sat staring at the clock. She smiled with the corners of her mouth down. "Home," she said, "and begin again. It's like battledore and shuttlecock. I was silly. I suppose I've brought it on myself. I ought to have picked it up, I suppose. I had time. Cheats. Just cheats. I never thought I should see him again. He was ashamed, of course. He had his own friends." For a space she sat still, staring blankly before her. She sighed, rubbed a knuckle in a reddened eye, rose. She went into the hall where her hat, transfixed by a couple of hat pins, hung above her jacket, assumed these garments and let herself out into the cold grey street. She had hardly gone 20 yards from Lagoon's door before she became aware of a man overtaking her and walking beside her. That kind of thing is a common enough experience to girls who go to and from work in London, and she had had perforce to learn many things since her adventurous Whortley days. She looked stiffly in front of her. The man deliberately got in her way so that she had to stop. She lifted eyes of indignant protest. It was Lewisham, and his face was white. He hesitated awkwardly, and then in silence held out his hand. She took it mechanically. He found his voice. "Miss Henderson," he said. "What do you want?" she asked faintly. "I don't know," he said. "I want to talk to you." "Yes?" Her heart was beating fast. He found the thing unexpectedly difficult. "May I? Are you expecting? Have you far to go? I would like to talk to you. There is a lot." "I walk to Clapham," she said. "If you care to come part of the way." She moved awkwardly. Lewisham took his place at her side. They walked side by side for a moment, their manner constrained, having so much to say that they could not find a word to begin upon. "Have you forgotten Whortley?" he asked abruptly. "No." He glanced at her. Her face was downcast. "Why did you never write?" he asked bitterly. "I wrote." "Again, I mean?" "I did in July." "I never had it." "It came back." "But Mrs. Munday?" "I had forgotten her name. I sent it to the grammar school." Lewisham suppressed an exclamation. "I am very sorry," she said. They went on again in silence. "Last night," said Lewisham at length. "I have no business to ask, but..." She took a long breath. "Mr. Lewisham," she said, "that man you saw, the medium, was my stepfather." "Well?" "Isn't that enough?" Lewisham paused. "No," he said. There was another constrained silence. "No," he said less dubiously. "I don't care a rap what your stepfather is. Were you cheating?" Her face turned white. Her mouth opened and closed. "Mr. Lewisham," she said deliberately, "you may not believe it. It may sound impossible. But on my honour, I did not know. I did not know for certain, that is, that my stepfather..." "Ah!" said Lewisham, leaping at conviction. Then I was right." For a moment she stared at him, and then, "I did know," she said, suddenly beginning to cry. "How can I tell you? It is a lie. I did know. I did know all the time." He stared at her in white astonishment. He fell behind her one step, and then in a stride came level again. Then a silence that seemed it would never end. She had stopped crying. She was one huge suspense, not daring even to look at his face. And at last he spoke. "No," he said slowly. "I don't mind even that. I don't care, even if it was that." Abruptly they turned into the King's Road, with its roar of wheeled traffic and hurrying foot passengers, and forthwith a crowd of boys, with a broken-spirited Guy involved and separated them. In a busy highway of a night one must needs talk disconnectedly in shouted snatches, or else hold one's peace. He glanced at her face, and saw that it was set again. Presently she turned southward out of the tumult into a street of darkness and warm blinds, and they could go on talking again. "I understand what you mean," said Lewisham. "I know I do. You knew, but you did not want to know. It was like that." But her mind had been active. "At the end of this road," she said, gulping a sob, "you must go back. It was kind of you to come, Mr Lewisham, but you're ashamed. You're sure to be ashamed. My employer is a spiritualist, and my stepfather is a professional medium, and my mother is a spiritualist. You were quite right not to speak to me last night, quite. It was kind of you to come, but you must go back. Life is hard enough as it is. You must go back at the end of the road. Go back at the end of the road." Lewisham made no reply for 100 yards. "I'm coming on to Clapham," he said. They came to the end of the road in silence. Then at the curb corner she turned and faced him. "Go back," she whispered. "No," he said obstinately, and they stood face to face at the cardinal point of their lives. "Listen to me," said Lewisham. "It's hard to say what I feel. I don't know myself. But I'm not going to lose you like this. I'm not going to let you slip a second time. I was awake about it all last night. I don't care where you are, what your people are, nor very much whether you've kept quite clear of this medium humbug. I don't. You will in future, anyhow. I've had a day and night to think it over. I had to come and try to find you. It's you. I've never forgotten you. Never. I'm not going to be sent back like this." "It can be no good for either of us," she said, as resolute as he. "I shan't leave you." "But what is the good?" "I'm coming," said Lewisham dogmatically. And he came. He asked her a question point blank, and she would not answer him, and for some way they walked in grim silence. Presently she spoke with a twitching mouth. "I wish you would leave me," she said. "You're quite different from what I am. You felt that last night. You helped find us out." "When first I came to London I used to wander about Clapham looking for you," said Lewisham, "week after week." They had crossed the bridge and were in a narrow little street of shabby shops near Clapham Junction before they talked again. She kept her face averted and expressionless. "I'm sorry," said Lewisham with a sort of stiff civility, "if I seem to be forcing myself upon you. I don't want to pry into your affairs, if you don't wish me to. The sight of you has somehow brought back a lot of things. I can't explain it. Perhaps I had to come to find you. I kept on thinking of your face, of how you used to smile, how you jumped from the gate by the lock, and how we had tea. A lot of things." He stopped again. "A lot of things." "If I may come," he said, and went unanswered. They crossed the wide streets by the junction and went on towards the common. "I live down this road," she said, stopping abruptly at a corner. "I would rather... but I've said nothing." She looked at him with her face white, unable to speak for a space. "It can do no good," she said. "I am mixed up with this." She stopped. He spoke deliberately. "I shall come," he said, "to-morrow night." "No," she said, "but I shall come." "No," she whispered. "I shall come." She could hide the gladness of her heart from herself no longer. She was frightened that he had come, but she was glad, and she knew he knew that she was glad. She made no further protest. She held out her hand dumbly, and on the morrow she found him awaiting her even as he had said. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Lover Mr Lewisham by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anthony Ogus. Mr Lagoon's point of view. For 3 days the laboratory at South Kensington saw nothing of Lagoon, and then he came back more invincibly voluble than ever. Every one had expected him to return apostate, but he brought back an invigorated faith, a propaganda unashamed. From some source he had derived strength and conviction afresh. Even the rhetorical Smithers availed nothing. There was a joined battle over the insufficient teacups, and the elderly young assistant demonstrator hovered on the verge of the discussion, rejoicing, it is supposed, over the entanglements of Smithers. For at the outset Smithers displayed an overweening confidence and civility, and at the end his ears were red and his finer manners lost to him. Lewisham, it was remarked by Miss Heydinger, made but a poor figure in this discussion. Once or twice he seemed about to address Lagune, and thought better of it with the words upon his lips. Lagune's treatment of the exposure was light and vigorous. "The man Chaffery," he said, "hath made a clean breast of it. His point of view—" "Facts are facts," said Smithers. "A fact is a synthesis of impressions," said Lagune, "but that you will learn when you are older. The thing is that we were at cross purposes. I told Chaffery you were beginners. He treated you as beginners. Arranged a demonstration." "It was a demonstration," said Smithers. "Precisely. If it had not been for your interruptions—" "Ah!" "He forged elementary effects." "You can't but admit that." "I don't attempt to deny it. But, as he explained, the thing is necessary, justifiable. Psychic phenomena are subtle. A certain training of the observation is necessary. A medium is a more subtle instrument than a balance or a borax bead. And see how long it is before you can get assured results with a borax bead. In the elementary class, in the introductory phase, conditions are too crude for honesty. Wait a moment. Is it dishonest rigging a demonstration? Of course it is. Your professors do it. I deny that in toto, said Smithers, and repeated with satisfaction, in toto. That's all right, said Lagune, because I have the facts. Your chemical lecturers, you may go downstairs now and ask if you disbelieve me, always cheat over the indestructibility of matter experiment. Always. And then another, a physiography thing. You know the experiment I mean. To demonstrate the existence of the Earth's rotation, they use Foucault's pendulum, said Lewisham. They use a rubber ball with a pinhole hidden in the hand, and blow the pendulum round the way it ought to go. But that's different, said Smithers. Wait a moment, said Lagune, and produced a piece of folded printed paper from his pocket. Here is a review from Nature of the work of no less a person than Professor Greenhill. And see, a convenient pin is introduced in the apparatus for the demonstration of virtual velocities. Read it if you doubt me. I suppose you doubt me. Smithers abruptly abandoned his position of denial in toto. This isn't my point, Mr. Lagune. This isn't my point, he said. These things that are done in the lecture theatre are not to prove facts, but to give ideas. So was my demonstration, said Lagune. We didn't understand it in that light. Nor does the ordinary person who goes to science lectures understand it in that light. He is comforted by the thought that he is seeing things with his own eyes. Well, I don't care, said Smithers. 2 wrongs don't make a right. To rig demonstrations is wrong. There I agree with you. I have spoken plainly with this man Chaffery. He's not a full-blown professor, you know, a highly thoroughly ornament of the Rock of Truth, like your demonstration-rigging professors here, and so I can speak plainly to him without offence. He takes quite the view they would take, but I am more rigorous. I insist there shall be no more of this. Next time, said Smithers with irony. There will be no next time. I have done with elementary exhibitions. You must take the word of the trained observer, just as you do in the matter of chemical analysis. Do you mean you're going on with that chap when he's been caught cheating under your very nose? Certainly. Why not? Smithers set out to explain why not, and happened on confusion. I still believe the man has powers, said Lagune. Of deception, said Smithers. Those I must eliminate, said Lagune. You might as well refuse to study electricity because it escapes through your body. All new science is elusive. No investigator in his senses would refuse to investigate a compound because it did unexpected things. Either this dissolves in acid, or I have nothing more to do with it, eh? That's fine research. Then it was the last vestiges of Smithers' manners vanished. I don't care what you say, said Smithers. It's all rot. It's all just rot. Argue if you like, but have you convinced anybody? Put it to the vote. That's democracy with a vengeance, said Lagune. A general election of the truth half yearly, eh? That's simply wriggling out of it, said Smithers. That hasn't anything to do with it at all. Lagune, flushed but cheerful, was on his way downstairs when Lewisham overtook him. He was pale and out of breath, but as the staircase invariably rendered Lagune breathless, he did not remark the younger man's disturbance. "Interesting talk," panted Lewisham. "Very interesting talk, sir." "I'm glad you found it so. Very," said Lagune. There was a pause, and then Lewisham plunged desperately. "There is a young lady. She is your typewriter." He stopped from sheer loss of breath. "Yes?" said Lagune. "Is she a medium or anything of that sort?" "Well," Lagune reflected, "she's not a medium, certainly. But why do you ask?" "Oh, I wondered. You noticed her eyes, perhaps. She is the stepdaughter of that man Chaffery, a queer character, but indisputably mediumistic. It's odd the thing should have struck you. Curiously enough, I myself have fancied she might be something of a psychic, judging from her face." "A what?" "A psychic. Undeveloped, of course. I've thought once or twice. Only a little while ago I was speaking to that man Chaffery about her." "Were you?" "Yes. He of course would like to see any latent powers developed. But it's a little difficult to begin, you know." "You mean she won't?" "Not at present. She is a good girl, but in this matter she is timid. There is often a sort of disinclination, a queer sort of feeling. One might almost call it modesty." "I see," said Lewisham. "One can override it, usually. I don't despair." "No," said Lewisham shortly. They were at the foot of the staircase now. He hesitated. "You've given me a lot to think about," he said, with an attempt at an off-hand manner, "the way you talked upstairs," and turned towards the book he had to sign. "I'm glad you don't take up quite such an intolerant attitude as Mr. Smithers," said Lagune. "Very glad. I must lend you a book or two. If your cramming here leaves you any time, that is." "Thanks," said Lewisham shortly, and walked away from him. The studiously characteristic signature quivered and sprawled in an unfamiliar manner. "I'm damned if he overrides it," said Lewisham under his breath. Chapter 14 Chapter 15 of Love and Mr Lewisham by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anthony Ogus. Love in the Streets. Lewisham was not quite clear what course he meant to take in the high enterprise of foiling Lagoon, and indeed he was anything but clear about the entire situation. His logical processes, his emotions and his imagination seemed playing some sort of snatching game with his will. Enormous things hung imminent, but it worked out to this, that he walked home with Ethel night after night for, to be exact, 67 nights. Every week night through November and December save one, when he had to go into the Far East to buy himself an overcoat, he was waiting to walk with her home. A curious inconclusive affair, that walk, to which he came nightly full of vague longings, and which ended invariably under an odd shadow of disappointment. It began outside Lagoons most punctually at 5, and ended, mysteriously, at the corner of a side road in Clapham, a road of little yellow houses, with sunk basements and tawdry decorations of stone. Up that road she vanished night after night into a grey mist, and the shadow beyond a feeble yellow gas lamp, and he would watch her vanish, and then sigh, and turn back towards his lodgings. They talked of this and that, their little superficial ideas about themselves, and of their circumstances and tastes, and always there was something that was with them unspoken, unacknowledged, which made all these things unreal and insincere. Yet out of their talk he began to form vague ideas of the home from which he came. There was, of course, no servant, and the mother was something meandering, furtive, tearful in the face of troubles. Sometimes of an afternoon or evening she grew garrulous. "Mother does talk so sometimes." She rarely went out of doors. Chaffery always rose late, and would sometimes go away for days together. He was mean. He allowed only a weekly 25 shillings for housekeeping, and sometimes things grew unsatisfactory at the week-end. There seemed to be little sympathy between mother and daughter. The widow had been flighty in a dingy fashion, and her marriage with her chief lodger Chaffery had led to unforgettable sayings. It was to facilitate this marriage that Ethel had been sent to Whortley, so that was counted a mitigated evil. But these were far-off things, remote and unreal down the long ill-lit vista of the suburban street which swallowed up Ethel nightly. The walk, her warmth and light and motion close to him, her clear little voice, and the touch of her hand, that was reality. The shadow of Chaffery and his deceptions lay indeed across all these things, sometimes faint, sometimes dark and present. Then Lewisham became insistent, his sentimental memories ceased, and he asked questions that verged on gulfs of doubt. Had she ever helped? She had not, she declared. Then she added that twice at home she had sat down to complete the circle. She would never help again. That she promised, if it needed promising. There had already been dreadful trouble at home about the exposure at Lagoons. Her mother had sided with her stepfather and joined in blaming her. But was she to blame? "Of course you were not to blame," said Lewisham. Lagoon, he learnt, had been unhappy and restless for the 3 days after the séance, indulging in wearisome monologue, with Ethel as sole auditor, at 21 shillings a week. Then he had decided to give Chaffery a sound lecture on his disastrous dishonesty. But it was Chaffery gave the lecture. Smithers, had he only known it, had been overthrown by a better brain than Lagoon's, albeit it spoke through Lagoon's treble. Ethel did not like talking of Chaffery and these other things. "If you knew how sweet it was to forget it all," she would say, "to be just as two together for a little while," and "What good does it do to keep on?" when Lewisham was pressing. Lewisham wanted very much to keep on at times, but the good of it was a little hard to demonstrate. So his knowledge of the situation remained imperfect, and the weeks drifted by. Wonderfully varied were those 67 nights, as he came to remember in after life. There were nights of damp and drizzle, and then thick fogs, beautiful, isolating, grey-white veils, turning every yard of pavement into a private room. Grand indeed were these fogs, things to rejoice at mightily, since then it was no longer a thing for public scorn, when two young people hurried along arm in arm, and one could do 1,000 impudent, significant things with varying pressure and the fondling of a little hand, a hand in a greatly mended glove of cheap kid. Then indeed one seemed to be nearer that elusive something that threaded it all together. And the dangers of the street corners, the horses looming up suddenly out of the dark, the carters with lanterns at their horses' heads, the street lamps, blurred smoky orange at one's nearest, and vanishing at 20 yards into dim haze, seemed to accentuate the infinite need of protection on the part of a delicate young lady who had already traversed 3 winters of fogs thornily alone. Moreover, one could come right down the quiet street where she lived, half-way to the steps of her house, with a delightful sense of enterprise. The fogs passed all too soon into a hard frost, into nights of starlight and presently moonlight, when the lamps looked hard, flashing like rows of yellow gems, and their reflections and the glare of the shop windows were sharp and frosty, and even the stars hard and bright, snapping noiselessly, if one may say so, instead of twinkling. A jacket trimmed with imitation astrakhan replaced Ethel's lighter coat, and a round cap of astrakhan her hat, and her eyes shone hard and bright, and her forehead was broad and white beneath it. It was exhilarating, but one got home too soon, and so the way from Chelsea to Clapham was lengthened, first into a loop of side streets, and then, when the first pulverant snows told that Christmas was at hand, into a new loop down King's Road, and once even through the Brompton Road and Sloane Street, where the shops were full of decorations and entertaining things. And under circumstances of infinite gravity, Mr Lewisham secretly spent 23 shillings out of the vestiges of that £100, and bought Ethel a little gold ring set with pearls. With that there must needs be a ceremonial, and on the verge of the snowy foggy common she took off her glove, and the ring was placed on her finger. Whereupon he was moved to kiss her, on the frost-pink knuckle next to an inky nail. "It's silly of us," she said. "What can we do? Ever?" "You wait," he said, and his tone was full of vague promises. Afterwards he thought over those promises, and another evening went into the matter more fully, telling her of all the brilliant things that he held it was possible for a South Kensington student to do and be, of headmasterships, northern science schools, inspectorships, demonstratorships, yea, even professorships, and then, to all of which she lent a willing and incredulous ear, finding in that dreaming a quality of fear as well as delight. The putting on of the pearl-set ring was mere ceremonial, of course. She could not wear it either at Lagoons or at home, so instead she threaded it on a little white satin ribbon and wore it round her neck, next her heart. He thought of it there warm, next her heart. When he had bought the ring he had meant to save it for Christmas before he gave it to her, but the desire to see her pleasure had been too strong for him. Christmas Eve, I know not by what deceit on her part, these young people spent together all day. Lagoon was down with a touch of bronchitis and had given his typewriter a holiday. Perhaps she forgot to mention it at home. The Royal College was in vacation and Lewisham was free. He declined the plumber's invitation. Work kept him in London, he said, though it meant £1 or more of added expenditure. These absurd young people walked 16 miles that Christmas Eve, and parted warm and glowing. There had been a hard frost and a little snow. The sky was a colourless grey, icicles hung from the arms of the street lamps, and the pavements were patterned out with frond-like forms that were trodden into slides as the day grew older. The Thames they knew was a wonderful sight, but that they kept until last. They went first along the Brompton Road. And it is well that you should have the picture of them right. Lewisham in the ready-made overcoat, blue cloth and velvet collar, dirty tan gloves, red tie and bowler hat, and Ethel in a 2-year-old jacket and hat of curly astrakhan, both pink-cheeked from the keen air, shyly arm in arm occasionally, and very alert to miss no possible spectacle. The shops were varied and interesting along the Brompton Road, but nothing to compare with Piccadilly. There were windows in Piccadilly so full of costly little things it took 15 minutes to get them done, card shops, drapers' shops full of foolish, entertaining attractions. Lewisham, in spite of his old animosities, forgot to be severe on the shopping class. Ethel was so vastly entertained by all these pretty follies. Then up Regent Street, by the place where the sham diamonds are, and the place where the girls display their long hair, and the place where the little chickens run about in the window, and so into Oxford Street, Holborn, Ludgate Hill, St. Paul's Churchyard, to Leadenhall, and the markets where turkeys, geese, ducklings and chickens, turkeys predominant, however, hang in rows of 1,000 at a time. "I must buy you something," said Lewisham, resuming a topic. "No, no," said Ethel, with her eye down a vista of innumerable birds. "But I must," said Lewisham. "You had better choose it, or I shall get something wrong." His mind ran on brooches and clasps. "You mustn't waste your money, and besides, I have that ring." But Lewisham insisted. "Then, if you must, I'm starving. Buy me something to eat." An immense and memorable joke. Lewisham plunged recklessly, orientally, into an awe-inspiring place, with mitred napkins. They lunched on cutlets, stripped the cutlets to the bone, and little crisp brown potatoes, and they drank between them a whole half bottle of some white wine or other Lewisham selected in an off-hand way from the list. Neither of them had ever taken wine at a meal before. 1 and 9pence it cost him, sir, and the name of it was Capri. It was really very passable Capri, a manufactured product no doubt, but warming and aromatic. Ethel was aghast at his magnificence, and drank a glass and a half. Then, very warm and comfortable, they went down by the Tower, and the Tower Bridge with its crest of snow, huge pendant icicles, and the ice blocks choked in its side arches, was seasonable seeing. And as they had had enough of shops and crowds, they set off resolutely along the desolate embankment homeward. But indeed the Thames was a wonderful sight that year. Ice fringed along either shore, and with drift ice in the middle reflecting a luminous scarlet from the broad red setting sun, and moving steadily, incessantly seaward. A swarm of mewing gulls went to and fro, and with them mingled pigeons and crows. The buildings on the Surrey side were dim and grey and very mysterious, the moored ice-blocked barges silent and deserted, and here and there a lit window shone warm. The sun sank right out of sight into a bank of blue, and the Surrey side dissolved in mist, save for a few insoluble spots of yellow light that presently became many. And after our lovers had come under Charing Cross Bridge, the Houses of Parliament rose before them at the end of a great crescent of golden lamps, blue and faint, halfway between the earth and sky, and the clock on the tower was like a November sun. It was a day without a flaw, or at most but the slightest speck, and that only came at the very end. "Good bye, dear," she said. "I've been very happy to-day." His face came very close to hers. "Good bye," he said, pressing her hand and looking into her eyes. She glanced round. She drew nearer to him. "Dearest one," she whispered very softly, and then, "Good bye." Suddenly he became unaccountably petulant. He dropped her hand. "It's always like this. We are happy. I am happy. And then you are taken away." There was a silence of mute interrogations. "Dear," she whispered. "We must wait." A moment's pause. "Wait," he said, and broke off. He hesitated. "Good bye," he said, as though he were snapping a thread that held them together. Chapter 15